G'day, mate. 40 here, talking to author, philosopher, attorney Ronnie Goodman. So I first learned about Ronnie approximately 6-9 months ago when I read his memoir, The Star Chamber of Stanford, on the secret trial and invisible persecution of a Stanford law fellow. But it is his upcoming work, Conservative Claims of Cultural Oppression, that really spun me right round. I've spent more time with this book than any other book in the past year. It's had more influence on my thinking than anything I've read in years. Then he's also got an upcoming work, The Critical Theory of Academia. And a few years ago, he published a work of philosophy called Two Orientations Toward Human Nature. Now, primary focus, I expect, for this stream will be his memoir, The Star Chamber of Stanford, on the secret trial and invisible persecution of a Stanford law fellow. And there were two primary antagonists in this story, and they just happen to be his Stanford law professors and early champions, Barbara Fried and Joe Bankman. And then suddenly this guy, Sam Bankman-Fried, hits the news. He is the child of these two prestigious Stanford law professors. And Ronnie, I just saw that these two Stanford law professors have hired this very high-powered crisis management lady. So
yeah.
That's kind of interesting.
They're already paying $10,000 a week, from what I've heard, in private security. I guess she's there to salvage reputation as opposed to their physical security.
Yeah. So, I mean, what chances does she have?
I don't know how she could help them. I saw that they had both canceled their classes for the winter and spring terms. And, I can't blame them, because even though, do I think they're involved in the criminal nitty gritty, I'm rather doubtful of that. But it really doesn't, the details of their culpability doesn't really matter when it comes to standing up there in a classroom before all of these law schools to whom you've been held up as, paragons of, not only intellectual virtue, but moral virtue as well. And to get up there with everybody knowing, your kid is Sam Bankman-Fried, I don't know how you could get a word out. So I really don't know what this PR specialist is supposed to help them with. Of course, Sam Bankman-Fried from early on has elected, it seems, to deal with this more like a PR crisis as opposed to a legal crisis. Hence his ill-advised willingness to get out there and talk to just about everyone. I would think his parents would be more cautious, but would be less concerned with the PR, more preoccupied with the legal minutia. Though still, I have to imagine that on some level their dilemma and his are quite similar because of intertwined. I mean, to imagine, I was actually, I didn't know about Sam Bankman-Fried for a good long while. And it was actually only a few months before the debacle that I happened across his name by chance. And I'm just looking at it, I'm thinking, wow, this guy has achieved a hell of a lot. What the hell have I done with my life? Well, needless to say, a few more months, I felt a little better about the comparison. And I think just psychologically, for this guy to be on top of the world, and his parents to be, by extension, on top of the world, as well as his springboard, and for that to not only be taken away, stripped away, but positively turned upside down in a matter of a month and a half. Your ego, because you're an elite, your ego is completely bound up with public perceptions of you. So maybe it's not that incomprehensible that they would take these kinds of measures. But I don't know what it can do. I mean, maybe they're hoping that he'll be exonerated in court. I can't imagine that happening, but it's possible. At the end of the day, a jury is a random collection of 12 people.
Yeah. Now, Joe Bankman and Barbara Fried are the antagonists in your book, but they're not the bad guys. They're just people with a different value system, a different philosophy, and people that you struggle against to some extent. In archetypal terms, they could be called gatekeepers. But why
Right.
don't you talk a little bit more about their role as your antagonists in your memoir?
Yeah, well, they were the ones who gave me the fellowship in the first place, which is why, I can hardly cast them as somehow being out to get me from the get-go. They certainly weren't, to the contrary, they had certain aspirations for me, which were certainly intertwined with their own ego aspirations for themselves. Because I think that, as I explained, if you put out a new grad onto the market, it secures a job somewhere, particularly at a prestigious place. That boosts your ego, that boosts your institution's ego, Stanford. And so they're putting this money in me. And and they're not completely closed-minded either, because it was conservative claims of cultural oppression, what you've been reading, which initially sparked their interest and got me the fellowship, among a few other things as well. So they weren't. I can't say they were narrowly dogmatic either. And yet, in part due to my own commitments, that eventually led to a clash, which the details, as you'll understand, require require a separate discussion to articulate. In fact, I think it would require you to read the book to form any kind of a grip on what I'm saying. But there was a certain we'll just say there was a certain passive aggressiveness which was created by my own failure to heed these academic principles and academic mores which they were trying to transmit to me. So certainly I would not say, oh, my book proves they're bad guys and now their kid proves that they're bad people, haha. I do think there's probably a connection between the two, but it's certainly more complicated than anything like that.
Yeah, no normal person reading your book would think, "Oh, Barbara Fried, Joe Bankman, these are bad people." I mean,
Yeah.
you don't portray them that way in the least. It's just two different perspectives on life, and I'll just give a small example from my own life when I was training to be an Alexander Technique teacher. With about a week to go before graduation, I just
Mhm.
published a blog post noting making several critical remarks about one particular approach to the Alexander technique,
Mhm.
and the proverbial stuff hit the fan because you're not allowed to publicly criticize anyone or any other approaches in the Alexander technique world if you want to have a role to play in the Alexander technique world. And so I completely destroyed all my relations with my teachers, which had developed on a daily basis over 3 years. I just blew it up, but they weren't
Right.
bad people. The Alexander technique was not a benighted community. It's just a clash of values. I really like to say what I want to say, and I am willing to give up almost anything to be able to say what I want to say. But that doesn't make my teachers or my profession bad. And you went through something similar.
That's right. And I think that even though, yeah, certainly I never call them, bad, malevolent people. I do say that they have the pathologies of their culture, the pathologies of their time, and certainly it has been well established that at least that both parents were very actively involved in the upbringing of their children. It wasn't just on particular occasion, don't do that, that's wrong, but they had a utilitarian philosophy which they went out of their way to inculcate, um, and which went on to form Sam Bankman-Fried's view. So of course one wants to ask, well, what is the connection between this utilitarian philosophy, which appears to have been held unanimously by the family, and what eventually happened, and it's very strange when Sam Bankman Fried gets interrogated, but whether by the New York Times or other parties, very much there is this, I did not knowingly intend to commit fraud. So, what he's telling himself is that it was not his intention that everything wind up the way it has, which is obviously true. He didn't want to lose people's money. He wanted to take people's money, make a lot more money, come out the hero, be rich himself. And to his mind, he may well have rationalized that, given what I'm doing, in the long run, everyone, even though I'm maybe violating this term of service, but in the long run, I will be better off. My clients will be better off because I will have made so much more money. So, sort of the arrogance to set aside the ordinary morality, which is a simple matter of absolutes. Don't commingle funds. Not too hard to heed if you're trying to. But I think, given his utilitarian background, he had to see himself as somehow above that ordinary morality. And I think his parents, in their rationalism, certainly conveyed that to him. Did they convey, oh, steal funds from FTX? No, but these are things that follow, or I don't want to say they follow logically, but they certainly can follow logically, insofar as you say, well, I'm going to judge morality by its consequences, which means, I'm not going to be bound by these hidebound rules that have been passed off from the generations to the next, because I have the ability to step back, and rather than applying them automatically, I'm going to look at the big picture and think about the actual consequences of my actions. So you have that philosophy combined with this very high level of self confidence in his own abilities. You put those things together, and you very easily get a disaster.
Now, I'm just thinking off the top of my head, what are the major differences between the right and the left, as I understand it, and Carl Schmitt makes this point repeatedly, is that pretty much every right-wing political orientation begins with the presupposition that human nature is not basically good. And it
Right.
seems like every left-wing political ideology begins with the presupposition that human nature is basically good, but capitalism, society, patriarchy, tradition, ignorance, lack of education has warped it. And so that then produces, two very different orientations to the world. One, the left wing side basically presupposes that people are born basically good, and we need to, get rid of those things that are holding people down so that their natural innate goodness is going to blossom. And the traditional perspective is, people are born selfish, and it's only through society, community, traditions that we're able to shape and restrain the natural moral anarchy that lurks inside everyone. Is that fair? And do you think that might have any light to shed on the Sam Bankman-Fried story?
Yeah, I think Bankman-Fried and especially his family are saying, well, we don't need to be restrained by these traditions. I think that, to the extent they would concede that there's something, I don't know that they need to take a super strong position on our inherent goodness or lack thereof, but certainly one important difference is that, however problematic we may be morally, uh the liberal elites, like the same Bankman-Fried said, I think that the individual human intelligence has the power to address and control that. Whereas I think on the conservative end, it's a much more humble understanding of individual capacities. Sal talks about the vision of the anointed on the left versus the tragic vision, the idea of there being these inherent limitations. On the left, they see tradition, I guess, as really the source of human misery, either as causing human beings to do things they wouldn't otherwise do, or to the extent they have certain inherent self-aggrandizing inclinations, as giving them permission to do something they wouldn't otherwise have permission to do. But your own sense of yourself, your own sense of your good intentions, can give you permission to transgress as well. Sam Bankman-Fried, he was a follower of I think it was a William McCaskill. He's an Oxford philosopher at the forefront of the effective altruism movement, which is an extension of utilitarianism. And shortly after the scandal, he said, well, we effective altruists have never advocated for the eschewing of ordinary everyday common sense, like don't steal funds, for example. That is not what we're saying. To the extent that we have been understood as arguing for that, well, then Sam Bankman-Fried has betrayed us. But I don't think that whole school gets off so easily, because if you are a true utilitarian, if you do ascribe this great ability to the human intelligence, or at least to the human intelligence of some people, to make these moral calculations unconstrained by tradition, well, then you are telling them essentially to ignore everyday common sense. Because if you're not going to ignore the everyday common sense morality, then you really don't need utilitarianism. So this is kind of after the fact saying, this doesn't really follow. This isn't what we're defending, but I think it can follow logically.
Yeah, my understanding of virtually any traditional right wing understanding of life is that we don't trust human beings on their own individually as far as we can throw them. Any right wing perspective says we have much more trust in family than we do in the individual. We have more trust in community than we do in the individual. We have more trust in social systems, from capitalism to feudalism to any system. But the individual just going out and doing what he thinks is right and good, I don't know any right-wing perspective on life that says, yeah, that sounds great. Is that fair?
Well, I guess it depends on how you define right wing. I mean, certainly if you look at the traditional right wing theorists in the vein of, most famously Edmund Burke and others, also Thomas Sowell, then I think that's certainly an accurate characterization. But in the American context, at least, I think the meaning of right wing is a little bit more problematic, a little bit
It's more like
more.
classical liberalism, which could even be considered part of the left. Like, is John Locke a man of the right from a Hobbesian Schmittian perspective? No.
Right. So yeah, it's a little bit more complicated in the American context, but I would agree with what you said as sort of a characterization of the great conservative theorists.
Right. I'm thinking Thomas Hobbes' perspective, most famous quote is that life is, nasty, brutish, and short, and that human beings left to their own devices will slaughter each other. And therefore, we need to make a compromise with the great Leviathan, the state, to keep men from swallowing each other alive, which basically replicates the perspective of the Jewish tradition, which instructs pray for the welfare of the government, because without it, men will swallow each other alive. Yeah. Which is very different from an attitude of follow your bliss.
Yeah, well, the enormous trust that was placed in Sam Bankman-Fried when he could get these multi-million-dollar investments while playing video games during meetings. I mean, it certainly highlights the extent to which on the left, at least the cultural left, there is certainly a certain susceptibility to certain cultural signals. He sends out those vibes, he sends out those signals, and that is enough to disarm people's suspiciousness. That's a very interesting phenomenon, because from what I understand, people who understand virtual currency and understand finance at an adequate level and were paying attention to what was going on with Sam Bankman-Fried, they could tell something was fishy well before the bankruptcy. You didn't have to be a genius to come to the right conclusions if you were just paying attention, and if you refuse to allow yourself to be bamboozled by this cultural left uh, signaling, which it seems disabled many people's critical critical function. And I think so that sort of highlights, I think, a major conservative theme that I discuss in Conservative Claims of Cultural Oppression, in the sense that the liberal sense that they have overcome this more primitive level of communication and understanding, where people respond to the prestige of cultural signals, or hero systems, as I discuss it, and instead respond solely to facts and apply abstract moral principles to facts. Clearly, that is not what happened in this case. There is a kind of liberal mystique, which is just as anti-empirical, just as anti-scientific as the mystiques that you will find on the right. And I think it highlights that fact, certainly.
I'm thinking off the top of my head about another distinction between the liberal world as I know it in academia and among my liberal friends in and around academia, is there's much more of a longing for this worldly utopia, while every right-wing person who's thoughtful has no understanding or yearning for utopia. It knows that essentially we're all locked in an iron cage together. Like, that's a traditional right-wing perspective on life. We are all locked in an iron cage together. There's no higher authorities going to bail us out. There's no escape from group conflict. Like, there's no utopia possible because different groups have different interests and resources are finite. So this whole string of utopianism in the Sam Bankman-Fried crusade and in the crypto world is completely anathema to any traditional perspective on life. Is that fair?
For sure, for sure. I mean, in the U.S., and I guess this is what I was hinting at before. Libertarians, who certainly have a strong affinity for Bitcoin, do identify themselves with conservatives, and I think conservatives are, insofar as it's an ally against the left, they don't sort of kick them away outright. Um, but yeah, for sure, Bitcoin. Obviously, it's the greater fool theory. So if you were lucky enough to have bought it at the right time, you could certainly make a killing. But yeah, its value, which is completely unmoored from any institution, from any practice. It's a form of value which is based on pure subjectivity, the pure belief by the individual in the value of the virtual currency, and nothing beyond that. So yeah, it is, I guess, an example of pure unhinged, uprooted modernity.
Right. So from the traditional perspective of from the skeptical view of human nature in the Hebrew Bible, to Thomas Hobbes, to Edmund Burke and Carl Schmitt, there's just, as far as I'm aware of the great thinkers who I consider right wing, there's very little consideration paid to a utopia in this world. There's it's never seen as an end to fundamental clashes of group conflict, the inevitability of conflict, the tragedy of politics. Like the traditional perspective on life is largely a tragic one. Is that fair?
I think that's fair, and certainly you could have no stronger an illustration of that view than the SBF scandal, where effective altruism leads to the opposite. There is his parents spending their lives trying to inculcate him with the appropriate moral philosophy, and just leads to their own embarrassment and professional downfall. it's really a story about the sort of the tragic limits of human competence and human, you know, and human cognition. That there's just like your intentions, your best efforts are, I guess, just a grain of sand among all the various factors that are going to determine the final outcome, a very inconsequential piece of the equation.
Yeah, I was remember the Joe Bankman interview, which is on YouTube, which came out just a few months before the Sam
The
Bankman-Fried
FTX
fiasco. Yeah,
FTX podcast interview.
yeah, and he is describing such a utopian vision of what FTX is going to be able to do for poor people and get them checking accounts and banking accounts, and that's not someone like steeped in a Hobbesian worldview would ever say, because like from a trad perspective, if you like create all these wonderful instruments, it's not going to revolutionize the lives of poor people, because from a traditional perspective, the greatest obstacle for poor people are, poor people's character. It's not, these external banking accounts.
Yeah, I mean, well, is it their character? Well, if it wasn't originally, certainly it becomes that, among other things. You know, Even if I might even if why do certain families fall into a cycle of poverty? Well, even if at the inception it's a function of blind economic forces, even that's what explains why somebody becomes homeless. The fact that after a certain point, the characterological obstacles to fixing the situation are going to assume a life of their own, even if there was nothing there from the outset. You know, yeah, I would agree that therefore, uh, that is to greatly overestimate the technical solutions, the efficacy of these kinds of technical solutions, like everybody having an FTX account. I guess that was the dream, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, from a traditional perspective, I lead my life as an Orthodox Jew. It's just taken for granted that every individual, in most circumstances, his greatest struggle is going to be with himself, and that is just seems to be completely absent from the Stanford law elite, the Joe Bankman FTX interview. But that worldview that the individual's greatest struggle is with his own, his own weakness, his own fragility, his own selfishness and cruelty and lust. That's the traditional perspective, but it seems to be largely absent from the elite perspective, which posits that an individual's greatest struggle is almost always with forces outside himself that have perhaps made him ignorant or bigoted, or he's surrounded by these negative forces. Is that fair?
Yeah, well, I mean, let's think about what SBF has said to explain, his situation. Yeah, I mean, insofar as he blames himself, he's only blaming his own inadvertent, incompetence. I wasn't quite on top of it as I should have been. I underestimated the challenge. That is the closest that he will blame himself. And besides that, it's bad luck, the Bitcoin market, and the machinations of his competitors. He blames them as well. But yeah, there's no actual struggle. And when I look at him, it really screws with your mind, because I don't know what you think, but like, does he believe what he's saying? And I just don't know, because on the one hand, if I just look at his like temperament and his persona, he seems to be exuding something sincere. Now that might be a complete illusion, but I think people know what I'm talking about. He really seems to believe that there's a certain innocent core of himself in there that he just needs to communicate to people in some way. Um, of course, objectively, how could he not know that the funds were being commingled? You know, how that could be the result of inadvertence, that beggars the belief. So when I look at the facts and I go back and I look at his performance, how can he possibly believe that performance? And yet he seems to believe it. At least, he's able to persist with it to an extent and at a level to suggest that he himself believes it. And how he can bring himself to do that. Uh, I mean, I would guess that has something to do with his upbringing and, the boundless self-confidence and self-love that his liberal parents instilled in him. And, maybe they thought they were doing a great job with that, but we saw the result.
So there's something else about the liberal narrative that always gets to me, and that is the laying out of a story of the ever onrushing increase in human freedom. Like we just need, new laws to protect the transgendered from being bullied. We need new laws to protect, this class from housing, employment discrimination. And we're always increasing human freedom, and we're part of this long march towards the sunlight of human freedom and flourishing. And I'm standing back saying, hell, you can never increase human freedom for one group, such as the transgendered, without taking away freedom from another group. And so one freedom that's been destroyed in this country is the freedom to discriminate. And I'm thinking in particular about what used to be called, or maybe still called, white shoe firms. There were white shoe firms, law firms, and financial firms on Wall Street who did not want to employ Jews. And one of the reasons they did not want to employ Jews is that they did not want to engage in any risky behavior. They wanted to stick by, their traditional morality of how you should operate, and they associated Jews, rightly or wrongly, with, a greater willingness to engage in risky financial instruments. Sam Bankman-Fried is not the first famous Jew who has pioneered and become, famous for adventures in risky financial instruments. Well, those bad old days where you had white shoe firms that would not engage in risky practices. And part of the way they protected themselves from that is by essentially staying within an Anglo-Saxon employment structure. Well, that is illegal now. You cannot operate, like the white shoe firms do. And so when you have to employ, anyone, regardless of ethnicity, religion, sexual orientation, etc., you are going to be introducing much more moral chaos into your firms because you don't have an agreed upon morality anymore. And so I'm thinking just off the top of my head, some of these risky financial instruments and adventures, they're much more likely in a multicultural society where we have less in common with each other. Like a diverse society means we have less in common with each other. In a traditional society or a traditional white shoe firm, we hold by a certain ethic. We're related to each other. We come from, a similar Anglo heritage, and there are just certain things that we don't do, such as, playing video games while pitching, for billions of dollars. So that traditional approach is now illegal, and the homogeneity, which meant that you knew more what was going on with other people, is now effectively illegal in the workplace. And so our newly, diverse, multicultural firms are much more wide open to this kind of moral anarchy. Any thoughts?
Well, I mean, so first of all, I mean, I think in the context of, let's say, white shoe law firms, you know, you go to the top law schools, which is where they're going to recruit most of their incoming associates. Really, regardless of your ethnic background, I think by the time you're there, I mean, you've gone through the college system, you've navigated that, you got into law school, you've made it through your third year. by that point in time, I don't know that ethnic sensibilities are so great. I mean, whatever we might assume they could be. So let's say the period you're talking about in the early 20th century, you've got your Jews on the Lower East Side, you've got your Italian neighborhoods, et cetera, et cetera. Um, what whatever legitimacy people's perceptions of ethnic differences may have had then, I think are in today's world, at least in the professional context, you know, greatly smoothed over by these institutions, which, for better or worse, make people a lot more the same than they used to be. Now, if you're going to say, okay, but is there a disproportionately large number of Jewish fraudsters up there, right? So yeah, SPF is being compared to Bernie Madoff, who's also Jewish, and yeah, I mean you can certainly point out to non-Jewish fraud, Enron and WorldCom and so forth. But is there a disproportionate number of Jewish fraudsters, financial fraudsters out there? Maybe there is, but I mean, I don't know. I mean, there's a disproportionate number of Jewish many things. Some of them good and some of them bad, obviously. Um, I mean, was there? I don't know. I mean, I'd be interested in someone, studying the instances of fraud in the US when it was a less multicultural society and more homogeneously Anglo-Saxon. Um, it would be very hard to measure just because, so many other things have changed since then as well. Uh, I think it would be quite difficult to prove that it was this one factor, ethnic heterogeneity, that was, by and large responsible for this increase in fraud. Assuming there has been an increase in fraud, I'm not sure, but that's the sort of thing where I would want to check my gut with whatever rigorous studies are available, and I don't know what is available.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about banking where innovation used to be a dirty word. In certain approaches to banking, certain approaches to financial instruments, innovation was a dirty word. Now, if there are a disproportionate number of Jewish fraudsters, there are also a disproportionate number of Jewish innovators. So, God forbid, I'm not saying, Jews are bad and we were better off when it was perfectly legal for companies not to employ them. I'm just pointing out that with every advance, quote unquote, in human rights and human flourishing, it always comes at a price. You are destroying freedom of association. And there used to be bankers and there used to be people in the financial world and in law firms where innovation was a dirty word. So obviously any firm with an outlook, innovation's a dirty word, is not going to be jumping on board the crypto train.
Right.
Right. Go ahead. Sorry.
No, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, that's just what struck me, that from a center and left wing perspective, innovation is almost always a great thing. From a trad perspective, immigration is something that you're highly skeptical of because we're so skeptical of human nature. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think so. I think though, it's fine to define the trad perspective, that way. But if that's sort of the essence of real conservatism in American life, then it's not a perspective which is nearly as vociferous as maybe one might hope. Even though you've got certain conservative skepticism of certain kinds of businesses, Facebook, Google, and so forth. By and large, in America today, people associate conservatism with this very raw, rugged individualism. And to the extent that they defend traditional values, it's not really qua traditional values. It's more, hey, we happen to believe these things, and we have these imperious, woke, politically correct leftists who are trying to obtrude upon our right to express these views. But ultimately, it's defended in the name of individualism. There's very little, barely, more or less negligible actual traditionalism in American political life. Now, maybe that might be motivating people, and they can't acknowledge what's actually motivating them, and so they need to maybe articulate some of their traditionalist sentiments in a more libertarian uh, vein. But I think uh, everyone is worried about how people are cowed by the wokeness and political correctness of the left. But you have to ask yourself, to what extent are bona fide traditionalists such as yourself, uh, you know, in society at large, have been suppressed, cowed. I don't know what the term is, from transgressing sort of the libertarian framework which mainstream conservatives have adopted, even if they don't want to call themselves libertarians.
Yeah, I mean, individualism is not a praiseworthy trait in most traditional societies, right? They're almost antipodes, right?
And yet in the American context,
Right.
it's very hard to retain your political credibility if you dismiss individualism.
Yeah. Yeah. Another thing that's just coming to mind, just all these thoughts coming to mind as I'm talking to you, is that there's much more of an emphasis on comportment on the traditional side of things compared to the liberal left things. So that you'd be playing video games while pitching a business is absolutely inconceivable from a traditional perspective. How you dress is very important from a traditional perspective. You wouldn't show up to work or to a work meeting in sweats or jeans and a t-shirt.
Uh-huh.
So
Right.
is that fair? Comportment, it tends to be much more of a traditional value and much less of a liberal left Stanford law value.
I think so, and I think we have to ask ourselves, why that is. So why on the woke left, as it were, are they going to dismiss the importance of these little morals, which is what I think uh, Gertrude. I'm going over the manuscript of Conservative Claims of Cultural Oppression, and so I'm going over how Gertrude Himmelfarb was saying, the Victorians, I mean, yeah, they had moral principles, but they also attached a lot of importance to the little morals, little everyday things that showed, you had character. So in this case, it would be, not wearing shorts when you're going to visit Tony Blair and Bill Clinton, the way SBF did, right? Not playing video games when you're talking to the board of Sequoia or Blackstone. And there's this idea that, yeah, well, we have, for an a liberated autonomous mind, our behavior is going to be driven by our ideas, by our thinking, not by these little everyday habits like how you dress or how you speak in certain contexts. Those are we are above that. We are governed by our mind, not by habit. So his decision, um, the way he dressed and conducted himself is certainly I mean, certainly, okay, look, Silicon Valley generally is kind of on the looser end of things. But I do think that he was in a kind of ostentatious way, even though he, supposedly he was not dressing ostentatiously, but his not dressing ostentatiously was itself an ostentatious assertion of this principle. I'm this truly rational actor. My actions are going to be guided by my intellectual conception of ultimate outcomes, not by these unthinking inherited mores like how you dress or how you conduct yourself at meetings. And that was part of his allure. It was actually, one more advertisement for his superior intelligence and the superior intelligence of his milieu. My brain is going to be what gives you the assurances you want. I don't have to be wearing decent decent pants. You know, that's the message. So yeah, I think that sort of was one more manifestation of the elite philosophy, certainly.
Yeah, and that's also perhaps also a class thing that the working class and the lower middle classes would place, I would expect, much more emphasis on comportment, and the upper middle classes and upper classes would be fine with less emphasis. Is that fair?
Yeah, they put less emphasis because they want to say, and this is actually something I discussed quite a bit. I think it's in uh I don't know, chapter 5 or chapter 6 of conservative claims of cultural oppression. The new Victorianism. How we really eschewed uh, Victorianism, and there is sort of the sense that yeah, like the lower classes have not necessarily yet absorbed this kind of Victorian self discipline. They can't take it for granted. They don't expect others to take it for granted in them, and therefore they need to give off these signals that they have indeed absorbed these disciplines, which would be by conducting themselves appropriately at a meeting, dressing the right way, and so forth. But Sam Bankman-Fried is essentially saying, I have gone beyond that earlier evolutionary stage. You know, you had to discipline yourselves, you have to monitor yourselves, you have to show that you're with it. But I, as a member of this elite, am just beyond that. Been there, done that. Um, my mind has achieved this autonomy, so
Yeah,
I can direct myself. I don't need these habits and mores to do it.
yeah. Do you remember Tim Tebow, the Christian quarterback for the Denver Broncos? It was a sensation about 10, 12 years ago. But whenever he talked to a reporter, he would always insist on addressing them as Mr. or Ms.
Right.
Like the only professional athlete to conduct himself that way. And that is a more traditional approach to life. How did you address your Stanford law professors? Did you address them by their first name, or did you
It
address
was
them as?
first name, yeah, and that's really fairly common all the way back in even in grad school as well. You know, and I think it's like that was how it is in Indiana. I don't know that it's like that everywhere. So I think, let's say, Fordham, where I did a postdoc, that's sort of a Catholic. I think there that might have been more professor, so forth. But I think most graduate programs, it is by their first name. Now at Stanford Law School, if you were just a student, for the most part, you would call them professor so and so. But if you're a student who's sort of moving into the academic track, then they already see you as, you're a student, but a would be colleague. So at that point, it becomes more common to refer to them by their first names. So that's sort of my sense of it. But in a normal graduate program like philosophy, humanities, or whatever, it's going to be a first name basis.
And do you think that Sam Bankman-Fried and his brother were raised to address their parents' friends by Mr. and Mrs., or this is, Jack and Jane?
I'm sure it was Jack and Jane.
Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, that would be. I mean, I'm just thinking from like a lot of my parents' friends were academics. They could have been called professors or doctors or whatnot, but it was sort of on a first name basis. Apparently, they were sort of bringing them to law school. They were playing on the floor there when they were toddlers. So everybody got to know them. So one of the I mean, it's been revealed. There were two other people who put up bond for his bail beyond his parents, and one of them was Larry Kramer, who's one of the other characters in the book. He put up $500,000 apparently, but I'm sure that to SBF he is Uncle Larry, more or less.
Yeah. And so from the reason from a traditional perspective is that we do this is because we don't trust people. We want to educate and mold people to recognize distinctions, gradations, and hierarchies. And it's not the great leveling where everyone's just on a first name basis. And because we don't trust people, we want them to dress more appropriately or more professionally than the normal human inclination. Because from a traditional perspective, we expect people will behave better when they're dressed in a suit as opposed to shorts and a T-shirt. I think that's pretty fair from a traditional perspective, and I think it's also pretty fair from a liberal left perspective that it's not going to make much difference whether someone's wearing sweats or wearing a suit in the morality of how they conduct themselves. What do you think?
Yeah, well, I mean, when you said that, I think back to my own experiences and my own transgressions. So I did not. I never wore shorts to the law school, but I certainly wore jeans. As did other people. So that would not. When I was a fellow there, and certainly I refer to all the professors by their first names. And and I'm sure there's sort of other of these markers of equality that are sort of part of the liberal elite Bobo dispensation. And I think to myself now, well, what if formally Stanford had been a more conservative place, and you always speak to them as professors and so forth, and everything had been much more ostensibly rigid? Would I have felt the license to go down my wayward path? Maybe not. Then you wouldn't have the memoir, or anything else. But arguably, even though it is a hierarchical place, the eschewal of these outward markers of hierarchy may have kind of given me a certain feeling of license to transgress, which I did. I think the overall the outcome, the book redeems it, but what have you. Yeah, these little things, it's very easy to dismiss them as small little things, which they are in the abstract, but they add up or fail to add up.
And with the traditional perspective, there is an acceptance of hierarchy as inevitable as the laws of gravity. That there are, essentially aristocratic type people. There are, monarchs. There are, I would never call any Orthodox rabbi by his first name. There's just an acceptance of gradations and hierarchy, and a recognition of the gradations and the hierarchy, and the idea of living in a world without hierarchy and gradations is just completely unfathomable from a traditional perspective. While it just feels like the son of Stanford Law graduates, hierarchy is something more that you want to smash. It's an outmoded, traditional, ignorant way of organizing human societies. We can do much better with human flourishing if we let go of all these traditional hierarchies. Is that fair?
Yeah, that's the idea. And and certainly when I think about the time where the events underpinning the memoir took place, yeah, I was like in my mid 30s at the time, so kind of, I kind of look. You have this irrational hierarchy, which is based on these outmoded prejudices about what rigorous academic work is. And I rebelled against it with, as I acknowledge in the book, kind of an overly naive sense of how easy it would be to topple it. And alas, here I am now, still, fighting that hierarchy, trying to get these books out. Even though I would think that sort of, even though my intellectual level compared to where I was in my mid 30s is much higher, but I'm totally detached from these fonts of power, and so I'm still sort of fighting it in a very uphill sort of way. And so yes, the hierarchy will always be there in one form or another. The forms can be very different. Initially when you had all these anthropologists who went out to see these non-Western societies, and they were just, overwhelmed, very impressed by the lack of hierarchy. And, later anthropologists said, well, when you kind of look more closely, yeah, it's not as overt or crude or categorical as it is in more complex societies, but you can certainly see it's there. And then when I look back at my own conflict with Stanford, because there's a liberal elite bobo ethos, certainly there was a tendency on my part to overlook that hierarchy and run right roughshod into it. But it is there, but that's fine. I accept this fight against the hierarchy. I don't even think about it in terms of who's right or wrong anymore. That's just the situation I'm in, which is not necessarily a situation I would wish upon most people. So, to challenge and overthrow hierarchy, I think it's good that there are certain people out there who deviate from the program and try to do just that. But it's certainly not a prescription for normal human flourishing in most cases.
Now, one of the most frequent admonitions I still receive from people I grew up with who are 20, 30 years older than me is be a good boy. So even at age 56, I talk to, friends of mine who are now in their 80s, and the way they'll close off a phone conversation is like, "You go be a good boy." I'm just wondering, what are the odds that was one of the frequent admonitions that Sam Bankman-Fried has received?
Yeah, well, I think I probably not, because for them to even say that would have been to acknowledge the possibility that he might not be a good boy, or that he might need, external encouragement. But when you have this very robust conception of potential human autonomy and self directedness and reflection, as you had in the Bankman-Fried household, I think they would not have gone out and said, be a good boy. That would have been kind of insulting. You would say, well, this is the good choice of action. Here's why. That would have been a respectful way of addressing him to their mind, not be a good boy. That's something, you could also tell a dog as well.
Right. But I mean, that would immediately typecast you as some ridiculous person stuck in a hidebound traditional way of life if you were overheard by elites or Stanford Law
Yeah.
professors instructing your child, now go be a good boy.
Right. Yeah, that would be completely out of place, I think.
Yeah, I mean, did you ever hear Stanford elite or any academic elite, instruct their children or their students, in essence, go out and be good? be a good girl, good boy.
Yeah, no, I think as you said, I think they would have felt embarrassed to be overheard saying that to say that. I mean, because it just like it assumes that this concept of goodness is uncontested, and only a rube, only a peasant would make such an assumption. So
Yeah.
yeah, even to use it in an unironic, uncontested way would be considered objectionable.
Now, Barbara Fried, I believe, famously wrote an essay against personal responsibility.
Yeah, the Boston, I think the Boston Review, something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm sure that wasn't the only time that that type of thinking, has flowed from her. So let's say you grow up in a home where it's taken for granted that individuals overwhelmingly are not responsible for their behavior. I think it would be common sense that that would have some effect on one.
I think so. I think again, of course, if you were to challenge her on that, she's gonna say, "Listen, you've got to. What I was saying is a lot more nuanced than that. I know that in real life, we're gonna blame each other for certain actions. We're gonna call these certain actions wrong. I know we're human, but I'm just saying when you sort of step back and you formulate public policy, and you have to look at the big picture." In those contexts, I would say be a little more reticent to ascribe blame. So, yeah, she would certainly say that, her argument was more nuanced than that. But even if it was, and I imagine it was, I've looked through part of it, still, the way you influence your children, it's on multiple levels. And, official precepts is one of them. But I think she probably also influenced them just by communicating this sense of their own sophistication that, of course we understand that in reality we're all caught up by a greater world more powerful than us. So take individual blame with a grain of salt. I think, that message was probably routinely communicated, maybe not explicitly, certainly not explicitly most of the time, but that would have been there. That blame is an unsophisticated emotion. Maybe it's necessary on certain occasions. Maybe it's an inescapable human social practice. But we enlightened ones, we understand that it's an unsophisticated emotion. Well, if that's conveyed to you, if that is conveyed to Sam Bankman-Fried, that yeah, this is kind of a primitive emotion, at least something to be scrutinized. Well, yeah, what is the chance that you're going to start applying it to yourself? They're going to be lower, even if your parents never categorically rejected it. The vibe, the ethos will have been communicated to you.
And I was just thinking off the top of my head, I think the traditional reaction to a Sam Bankman-Fried type scandal would be, what the hell is wrong with Sam Bankman-Fried and his parents and his community? Because from a traditional perspective, there aren't individuals nearly so much. They're just members of a tribe or a community or an extended family. Like this idea that we're all individuals born with certain inalienable rights, such as life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That is not a traditional perspective on life. That is a ridiculous perspective on life. That is an absurd, left-wing commie perspective on life, to dramatically overstate the case. While I think from a sophisticated liberal left perspective on the Sam Bankman-Fried scandals of our time is, like, where did our regulation of financial instruments go wrong? How did we get our regulation so wrong? So it seems to me that the trad perspective is more ironically, like, where did this individual, his community, family, go wrong? And the
Right.
sophisticated left liberal one is, how did we in our legislation not have, more sophisticated laws about this type of thing? What do you think?
Yeah, well, they're both valid inquiries, and I think that at the end of the day, maybe even if you espouse a certain individualism, maybe no one can really live up to it fully because at the end of the day, Sam Bankman-Fried's parents, there is a certain shame which has now fallen upon them by virtue of having spawned him, and there's really no getting out of that. At the end of the day, like they can, they were true individuals. They can say, listen, we did our best. We never endorsed this stuff. We're all free. We made these decisions. He made his decisions. Whatever, whether legal or illegal, we were not involved with that. Not only would they not say that, because that would be seen as throwing him under the bus. But another reason they wouldn't say it is just because it's discordant with this primordial parental pride, which they or shame, as the case may be, which they have felt and will continue to feel in one form or another. And so, but of course, do they believe in individualism? Well, it's not completely consistent with their utilitarian philosophy either, because an individual is has been no less than anything else been caused by these deterministic social forces, or I should say her no blame philosophy. So there it's a mess of contradictions. You don't believe in individualism insofar as you will forbear uh, severe blaming practices, but you do believe in individualism insofar as you exalt in your purportedly superior intellect's ability to calculate moral outcomes without reliance on blindly inherited tradition.
Now, wouldn't Joe Bankman and Barbara Fried, argue that any attribution of shame to them for their child's misbehavior, it shows a lack of moral sophistication, that it's a product of ignorance and bigotry, and that people need more education to be able to, transcend these primitive perspectives on life?
That argument would be consistent with views that they've surely expressed, but it would contradict their own feelings, because
Yeah.
on some level, you can, whatever. And this is a profoundly traditionalist slash conservative point, that whatever your theories, you are bound by certain sentiments, and they feel a certain responsibility for their son's actions. They feel they are defined by their son's actions on a certain level. They felt that when they had a heightened conception of his actions. They continue to feel that now that they know the truth. They just feel shame rather than pride. So I think their very gut feelings about the situation is at a minimum in tension with their modernist morality.
Yeah. Yeah. And did you ever hear Sam Bankman-Fried's parents talk about, what's wrong with so and so's parents? How could they produce a child like this?
I did not. I can't say whether or not they've ever said something like that. I mean, it's a normal way of thinking, and if you were to encounter parents and children where you could detect a certain continuity of the pathology, that would be a very natural thing to say. But I can't. I've not heard them say that, but I've not been around them in context where they might have said that. So I can't really say whether they would or wouldn't.
And did you ever hear them talk about fraudsters, the Bernie Madoffs, anyone who's put off anything akin to what their son did? Do you recall any commentary from them on this type of what trads would call
I
human
don't. I
depravity?
don't recall such commentary.
Okay, interesting. And along part of the liberal left elite worldview is that punishment's a dirty word because in a sophisticated understanding of reality, people aren't responsible for their behavior. Therefore, punishing them for things that they're not responsible for is retrograde. Is that fair?
Yeah, well, that is indeed, Barbara's view. You know, I mean, I don't think that anybody can truly climb above retribution. I don't know that she would argue that everybody could, because she certainly, I do think that she, for all her progressivism, I think she had some appreciation, at least, for the crooked timber of humanity, that we are sort of given to certain reactions, which, rational or irrational, we can't fully transcend. Uh, so I think that she would herself acknowledge that, retribution is not, she's not claiming that you can snap your fingers and be over it. And certainly my own encounters with her, in my hypothesis, accept it or not, I think that she was certainly driven by feelings of retribution, which is completely normal. Um, so, yeah, she might say that, but there's limits to how much she could actually act on that.
Yeah, so you're also saying that the dominant liberal left system is in some ways anti human.
Um, yeah, well, it's I guess it comes down to how you define human. I mean, certainly human nature. We don't want to lose sight of the crooked timber of humanity amidst superficial changes. But certainly, I think you can't deny that history and societies have been able to affect human sensibilities, to a certain positive extent, not enough that I would say abolish the police or anything like that, of course. Um, but that it can't do anything. I, I think that would be too strong. I think that would be as anti-empirical as saying that it can't do anything.
There's a radio talk show host who had a big influence on my life named Dennis Prager. He would make the following argument, which I present to you for your response. He would claim that law school makes a lot of people worse because they substitute legality for morality. So I come from a society, Australia, which is not litigious. So if you do something wrong, you're expected to fess up, not to keep quiet about your culpability, in case it places you in much more danger in litigious ways. So you are the product of a legal education. Are there common ways that come to mind how a legal education in the United States of America at this time and place makes people worse in the sense of morally, less moral because they become better at thinking legally rather than morally, and better at navigating around a system, more effective, say, at telling lies, but doing it in a legal way so that, you don't get disbarred?
I mean, certainly it could in certain situations. No, no question. But I think hopefully, I think most lawyers understand the distinction. I've certainly have had clients who come up with cases, and I say, well, you may have been treated unfairly. I agree they weren't reasonable, but legally, they haven't done anything illegal. So I mean, different people will, to different degrees, allow their profession areas of professional concern to maybe swallow up the rest of their lives to an undue extent, to define their overall sensibilities to an undue extent. But I think there is so much variation on that front that I would be quite hesitant to, you know, issue a big generalization about the effect of law school.
Yeah. Now, coming from my own deeply flawed perspective, I think, like many people, I often try to, reframe reality in a way where I'm the hero, and everyone else is, not nearly as heroic as myself. And so, one of my most common, reactions to my far more successful peers is that these people are careerists. They put their career before everything else. They would never have the courage to do the sort of things that I've done because they don't want to be ostracized. And
Right.
so, as we're talking, I'm just thinking, uh, being a careerist is perhaps much more compatible with the liberal left perspective, because if you're a trad, there are so many things more important than your career, such as
Right.
your community. So, is that fair? Is careerism? I mean, I'm sure you see that with many of your peers who are not as intelligent as you. Haven't produced the work of the quality of you, but pull in 4 times the income and have far more success and honor and status in this life. And surely you sometimes also think, bloody hell, a bunch of careerists, totally just towing the line. Any thoughts?
Yeah, well, I mean that is certainly the case. I mean, certainly, independence of thought is in this society, it is valued only up to a certain extent and only up to certain contexts. And yeah, I mean, it's certainly tempting to try to adopt this sort of viewpoint. I'm carrying the cross. I have made these sacrifices which they are not willing to make. But at the end of the day, it's a matter of temperament. I don't know that I don't want to indulge in those feelings too much because for whatever psychological reasons, I have a certain recalcitrance, which is forcing me to push back against these institutional structures. And there are others, the careerists, who were just born without those dispositions, and that made life a lot easier for them. And so I can say that's not fair, but there's really at a certain point you realize like there's no to say it's unfair is at least to covertly express a hope for some sort of justice in this world at some point. And there's really nothing to be gained by waiting for such justice. And because there's nothing to be gained for waiting for that kind of justice, um, there's nothing to be gained by being getting moralistic about the careerism or of others. Careerism is just falling into line. Falling into line is just default human nature, which assumes one form or another in every society. So that's what I don't like about the term careerist. Not that it's inaccurate to say that people who just kind of meld into their environment will do better, but it sort of suggests that it's a particular kind of priority or value system or ideology, when in reality that's just like default human behavior. And not being careerist, not falling into line for whatever reason which you can or maybe might not be able to articulate, that is simply a fate which befalls certain people, befalls me. And you try to deal with that. And sure, I hope in the back of my mind, I can't deny, I hope that sort of my book will finally attract enough attention, before I die, that I can look back and I can announce, haha, I was not a careerist, ergo I did not achieve X, Y, and Z. But this book redeems it all, and everybody recognizes that it redeems it all. That would be wonderful if I could do that, at my deathbed, ideally before I reach my deathbed, but maybe not. And so I have to just resign myself to the possibility that from the vantage point of conventional social status, the careerists will have a leg up on me until the end of my days. I don't want to highlight it as a problem because because I want to accept it as
Okay.
just the
Okay.
background of
I got it.
things.
I got it. So, but my deeper point is that careerism is hardly compatible with a traditional perspective on life. Careerism is an individualist perspective on life, which is largely incompatible with the traditional perspective on life. The traditional perspective on life, as I understand it primarily, is that we're not primarily individuals. We are members of tribes, groups, communities, nations. And so once you recognize that you're not primarily an individual, but you're a member of a tribe, group, community, or nation, then putting your own career first as your top priority is just incompatible with that understanding of yourself as part of a tribe. And so,
But
go ahead.
I would say, but I think that uh, careerism involves its own tribalism. It's in the abstract, it's a very individualistic attitude, but to be a successful careerist, you have to become attuned to how the tribe thinks, and not just in a calculating sense. You really need to absorb its sensibilities on a reflexive level. So
Yeah, that's a great point.
it really, that's something that I highlight, yeah, in I think all of the works which you've read, which is the covert, surreptitious tribalism and conservatism of the liberal elites. You have these human constants, and they're going to get expressed one way or the other.
Yeah. Now, when you look at Sam Bankman-Fried and his mother and his father, I think it'd be fair to say, just from an outsider perspective, these are careerists. However devoted they are to their family, these very clearly seem to be people who've put their career before everything else.
Um, yeah, I mean, you kind of have to be.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, but I mean, in their minds, they're not putting career above family, because part of their role as family members, as mom and dad, is to uh, transmit the correct career sensibilities to their offspring. So, to their minds, it's all reconciled.
Yeah. And another thing I'm thinking about as we're talking is that also from a liberal left perspective, not only is punishment a dirty word, but vengeance is a dirty word, while more people in a traditional society are quite at ease with vengeance. We even understand and are fine with every form of punishment contains an element of vengeance. I'm fine with that. Every
Yeah.
form of punishment contains an element of vengeance. I am fine with appropriate levels of vengeance, but from a liberal left perspective, that is retrograde and primitive and the sort of bigotry that we should, seek to rise above. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, it's one more form of bigotry, founded on a lack of understanding of natural causality. Yeah, that would be like sort of one of a whole collection of views that, to refer to conservative claims of cultural oppression, that they would identify with the poorest self, sort of an embedded self, which is sort of subject to the stimuli of its immediate environment and its own powerful emotions. Yeah, they see that as sort of they see retribution as appealing to a less evolved sensibility. They certainly believe that. Yes.
And when a trad encounters a story like Sam Bankman-Fried, he expects human frailty. I expect human frailty. I expect fraud. There's nothing remotely surprising to me about this fraud coming along. Like when the news hit, like there was nothing shocking, because that's what we expect from human beings. Like I expect everyone to try to take as much as they can while still feeling righteous. So that's like one of the most common I think, analyses of, how much will people steal at work. They will steal not everything they can get. They will steal as much as they can still feel good about themselves. And
Right.
so I think that's a traditional perspective on life. I'm just wondering what's the liberal left quintessential reaction to the Sam Bankman-Frieds of the world. I suppose it would primarily be about we need better regulation.
Um, yeah, they're gonna say we need better regulation, though. I mean, I don't know that I don't know how persuasive it is, because if they went into their computer system and they purposefully created mechanisms that obscure what was actually going on, that's the sort of thing that's quite hard to regulate. Um, I think I read Larry Kramer saying, like, everybody who knows them, they can't, you know, imagine they would be involved with this. So they're left with not really the most impressive explanations. They have to say shit happens. They have to say, you had a bad apple. He went bad. He broke bad. They they have no framework by which to explain the phenomenon, other than individual dereliction. Barbara Fried herself wrote in that article. I mean, when she's thinking, people's backgrounds determine their later criminality. She was not thinking about herself or her family. She's thinking about, the inner city, no father, problems set in from day one, etc. But likewise, can we say by that same token that maybe Sam Bankman-Fried doesn't deserve too much blame, or doesn't deserve all the blame he's getting, because it wasn't his fault that he was born into this elite culture, and had this arrogance fostered in him, bit by bit.
So one of the most ridiculous parts of the modern liberal left elite worldview, from my perspective, is this notion of human rights that extend beyond the nation state. I mean, the idea that there's any such thing as like global human rights, universal human rights, that or in the Declaration of Independence, that each man is, were inalienable rights, just seems like the most ludicrous thing in the world. Because from a Trump perspective, there are no rights beyond those that are guaranteed by a particular nation state, which are backed up by the power of the sovereign of that nation state and its ability to do violence against those who would threaten those rights. But when we're talking about Sam Bankman-Fried's world and the crypto world, it's almost like a subset of universal human rights. When you hear Joe Bankman talking in that FTX interview that we're going to be able to essentially guarantee these basic human rights, such as to a checking account to people, and do it around the world. From a Trump perspective, there are no rights beyond what the sovereign, the nation state, can extend to its
Uh-huh.
citizens, which will constantly be changing depending upon the circumstances. Any thoughts?
Well, I think I remember that I read, Joe Bankman. I think a lot of even though he was involved, as the FTX video indicates, in the inception of FTX and getting its first legal department in there. Later on, he was more involved in sort of the charities, and they gave out some prizes to, like, these kids, and the whole idea was that we're gonna kids who maybe are not well enough connected to have banking accounts, they can have accounts here with FTX, and some of them put that money in there, and then it was lost when they filed for bankruptcy, and froze all the assets. And apparently, from what I read, Joe Bankman did actually, like, use some of his own money, like some $30,000, um, to compensate those kids. And I can think, like, what would drive him to do that? Well, just like the huge embarrassment of being out there and saying, "Here, I will. You are from a disadvantaged background, but here I have the remedy to help you, and then as a result of their kids' machinations, those poverty-stricken kids are even worse off than they were initially. Uh, quite, quite the irony. And so, yeah, I mean that does highlight what I think you're referring to, which is this very Hobbesian world where intentions either don't count for anything. At best, they don't count for anything. At worst, they are the very opposite of what they appear.
Yeah, I mean, this idea that you can create a financial instrument independent of the nation state uh, just does not, accord with a traditional perspective on life. I mean, we see the nation state as that which determines rights, which determines, value. It's like
Yeah.
what determines the value of the United States dollar is, the United States government with its nuclear weapons and, its ability to commit violence.
Yeah, oh, for sure. The whole idea of Bitcoin strikes me as completely ridiculous. And in the wake of the whole scandal, I sort of looked around YouTube to look at this Bitcoin culture, and they're like, this is going to protect you from inflation. The federal government will just devalue your money, and it's just like, yeah. So we've had like some undue inflation for the first time in like 40 years, went up to 9% versus Bitcoin, which like in a matter of like a few weeks or a few months lost 80% of its value. Uh, it seems like an absolutely crazy notion. I'm glad I have never invested any money in Bitcoin or any other virtual currency, and I'm gonna continue to do just that.
Yeah, I mean, from a trap perspective, you never get to graduate from the nation state, whether it's financial instruments, human rights. It all comes down to the power of a particular sovereign and nation state to do violence. Without that, you've got bupkis.
Oh, for sure. I mean, you have to look, you've got to be grateful, living in the US, where you are. I mean, there's lots of places where you're relatively safe, but you are really the most safe here. Yeah, and if you don't live in one of these places that can fend for itself, then it's a matter of luck of whether your interests happen to coincide with those of the great powers, as they do in Ukraine. Elsewhere they may not, and then you got a problem.
Have you heard from any of your peers, anyone you went to Stanford with, any academic legal elites on your memoir? Any particularly, interesting feedback that you've received on your memoir from people within that elite world?
Yeah, well, I can't mention his name, but certainly I got contacted by another former fellow. He was a fellow much more recently than I was, but he likewise experienced a good deal of tension with Joe Bankman and with um, Stanford Law School generally. As of this other girl who he knew, and he told me they both read it, and it was a kind of a cathartic release. Finally someone has like gone out there and like spoken our truth to the world. So that's always a good feeling. As far as I've got somebody who's writing a book on the whole thing. I think I'm going to speak to her tomorrow. Aside from that, I've gotten kind of weird feedback on my Amazon reviews. Like this latest one, it was written by this guy. I looked up his name. He's a Stanford JD, has a PhD from Michigan, teaches at this intellectual properties institute in Syracuse, and he's like, I got a 1 star. He says he read the whole thing, and he's comparing me to Brett Kavanaugh. Like I'm in that vein. Like, I was like, what the hell? Have you really read the book? It's just like so out of left field. You know, like when you read the book, like I think you speculated, like it sounds like you might be paranoid schizophrenic. Well, there at least like I understand where you're coming from at least. Like there's like it's based in something, whereas this is it just seemed like he was trying to find some sort of random disparagement. So I don't know what's going on there.
Yeah.
Uh, that was really weird. So I don't know. Hopefully my YouTube channel will help me get my name out there a little bit. But even the negative reactions that I've received are sometimes very very strange.
I'm wondering if there's another area in this story where the liberal left perspective is more vulnerable, and that is in the area of reputation. So, as someone who does not believe in any rights that are not guaranteed by an army, I understand that my reputation does not belong to me. My reputation belongs in the minds of other people, and it's not mine. And
Yeah.
while people with a more right-centered worldview, which does seem to be the liberal left worldview, they do seem to have much more of a delusion about rights to their reputation, and so this would be like very, very disturbing for someone with that kind of worldview if they get thrown into a maelstrom like the Sam Bankman-Fried. Like, I understand my reputation doesn't belong to me. While I'd rather have a good one than a bad one, I have absolutely no power over it. There's no way that I can control my reputation because it's not in my hands. And my reputation's in your head and your head and your head and your head. While the rights perspective on life must be incredibly disturbed by these sorts of turns of event when they must fight against the recognition that their reputation does not belong to them.
Yeah, no, that's I have to say that even though I critique like the very idea of meritocracy in my book. Still, having been in an academic environment for so long, I've certainly absorbed uh, certain, arguably delusional expectations about one's merits being recognized, and maybe an over idealized view of other people's intellectual honesty. So I have to. It shouldn't. It shouldn't shock me at all that some guy's just reaching for whatever negative thing he can find to write down. Plausible or not. Um, Yeah, but I would like to absorb that stoicism. I think I've learned how to do that to a significant extent in the like the 9 months since the book was released. I've got no control on who the next reviewer on Amazon is. It could be the most terrible thing in the world. There's nothing I can do about it. But yeah, if you come from an academic background, then I guess that would be SBF as well. Yeah, you do think you have a right to your good name, whereas
Yes.
as you point out, it's really the last thing you have any control over.
It must be so many shocks to the elite liberal left worldview to go through an experience like this. What was your experience like rereading your magnum opus, the one on
The
conservative
claim.
claims of cultural oppression? What was it like?
So,
You hadn't read it really in 5 years or so.
yeah, and I'm not through the whole thing yet. I'm actually like on page 460 through 480 out of like 680 700. So I'm about two-thirds of the way through. I haven't looked at it in 5 years. And so right now, I mean, I think you're right. I think it's pretty close to publication. I'm going through it. There is some repetition. There is some unnecessary verbiage. So I'm going through there and just like cleaning that up, but making the language a little bit more direct. But I feel pretty good about it. Like by and large, it still makes sense to me.
Yeah.
This many years later. So I'm gonna run through it a few times. I'll self-publish it again if need be. I'm not gonna spend years at the doorsteps of publishers trying to find somebody who's interested. If I do, I do.
I remember when I self-published a book, I was gobsmacked. The overwhelming dominant reaction that I got when people found out I self-published a book was, "How do you plan to market it?" I don't know. Is that been like a primary reaction that you've received to your memoir? I'm just shocked that probably 36 people asked me that question.
Yeah, well, I mean, I for most people, most people who publish, even with fairly large publishing houses, are responsible for their own marketing.
Yeah.
And if you're Stephen King, then maybe the publishing house is going to pick up the tab. But I found out, I definitely did try to market it. I had ads on Facebook, on various online literary journals. I put out some press releases. So I did some things which got the book some attention. But at the end of the day, it's going to have to be marketed organically, like from person to person, maybe through my YouTube videos. But there's really there's not much that I can do. The amount of money, ads make no sense at all. I mean, the amount of money I have to spend on ads relative to the increase in sales, it's a total dead end. So, it's I found some marketing routes. I don't know whether a marketing professional could have found something better. Maybe not. It might just be that, like, owing to the nature of the book, not everybody's going to leap on it, and it's going to just take word of mouth, trickle from one person to the next, and hopefully eventually it'll spread that way. I don't know that I would be better off if I was part of a big publishing house, because a lot of those books don't sell very well either. I don't know. I have no idea.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Any questions that I should ask you that I haven't asked you?
I think that's good. We're still at the early stage. His trial is next fall. I would just say, the SBF route, it has created some interest, but I still think that the nature of the book presents an uphill challenge.
Yeah. Yeah. But it's so important. I mean, particularly the magnum opus, the conservative claims of cultural oppression, that just changed the way I understood reality in ways that no book has done for many years. It is absolutely your magnum opus.
I appreciate that.
Yeah.
I mean, I always saw the memoir as sort of a way to, draw attention to it. Now that it has its own merits, and like writing it is fun. But yeah, in terms of the level of theory, that's all in a conservative claims.
Yeah, just a mammoth book. I've had a hell of a time marketing it to people, but
Yeah.
it's so good, so important. But it is hard work. It's not a beach book.
For sure.
Okay, I'm going to move on with a solo show for a while. So, Ronnie, thanks for coming on the show. It's great to talk to you again.
Well, thanks for having me again, and let's stay in touch and talk again in a while.
Sounds good. Sounds great. Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
See you, Luke.
Take care, Ronnie. Take care.
Take care.
Okay, I want to play an excerpt here. This is the Decoding the Gurus, Professors Chris Kavanaugh and Matthew Brown. Matt. Come on, Matt.
Okay, so you're back. I randomly invited other people to try and cover for you, but can you hear me?
Just come on, guys.
I can hear you. I'm sorry. I'm just trying to turn my video off.
I didn't get
That's all right. Don't worry if you can't, Matt.
And I didn't get the timestamp
right.
I don't have an Australian accent.
Oh, look.
I get reverberation. I can hear myself again.
No, come on,
not
guys. Get
on
to the
my
point.
side. Maybe in your... Oh, I'm sorry. That's horrifying. You're Australian as well.
Yeah.
So
Come on.
Before I forget, I'm going to mention this guy's name. There's a guy called Jim Newman, and he had a conversation with Sam Harris, like a 2-hour conversation on the app. Nobody will know who Jim Newman is because he's a very minute. No, you're not on screen, an influential hog dealer. Your connection is not working.
Oh, damn, I got the
at least
timestamp wrong.
Hit this button. Individual. There's just a collection of sales and experience that I noticed, Kirsten. You disappeared yourself. I'm alone again. I think if
Come on, guys. I'm
can't
trying to run a professional show
just
here.
push a button and he can reappear. But both say that they both know what the other one is saying, but the other one is kind of wrong because the only person that's right is them. And if you agree with them, you can't have a different opinion. So it's like two people with that perspective, and it's like maddening to listen to because they just like any time that they want to point out a thing, one of them will slip to saying that, you know, there is no real, like, if you get angry at something, what happens? But then one will say, well, but anger doesn't actually exist. Anger's not a thing. And then the other one, well, okay, yeah, we agree. Anger's not a thing, but it's like there's an experience of anger. And then the other one will say, well, but experience is a word that means something happened, but nothing happened. And it's like 2 hours of that just going right.
Wait, I finally understand my notes. I finally understand now the timestamp, right, about building 7.
As a former Jimmy Dore fan who just hates him now or dislikes his content.
Yeah, building 7, World Trade Center.
I'd also like to note that it took Neil deGrasse Tyson to tell Joe Rogan that the moon landing was real. Like, he had to come on his show and like berate him for 2 hours before he would finally.
Did that work?
Probably not.
Yeah, I still get on occasion like any of the conspiracy theories that Joe has supposedly forgotten. As soon as he's in the room with Eddie Bravo or, you know, the right people, he'll just be like, yeah, but man, there are questions about the, you know, building 7 and, you know.
Buildings don't fall like that when they get hit by planes. They tip over.
Game over. It's and thing like I feel like building 7 and that kind of thing, it's just something you will see flop into, like if somebody is talking about building 7 in a conspiratorial manner, it's a warning sign. Because like Eric years ago said something about, you know, uninteresting questions, and he was like, what happened with building 7? And there's a book there's a journal article about conspiracy theorists in psychology, and the title of it is something like "What Happened to Building 7: The Psychology of, you know, 9/11 Troopers." And it's just like whenever you see that and you kind of point it out, and people are like, "Oh, he's just making a comment in a tweet," and you're like, "No, that's the mind." Like, yeah,
just asking questions.
Yeah. So, but I agree. I'm at that kind of fits your point that, you know, Jimmy Dore, Glenn Greenwald, Matt Taibbi. I know they're political, but I think we should look at them because they annoy me. And also,
Sam's not fond of Glenn Greenwald.
I don't think anyone
Sam
is.
Harris is not fond of him.
No, but he hates him for like a completely separate reason than most people. Like, because he used to hate Sam Harris and he used to be celebrated because he criticized Sam Harris, right? So it's funny. Glenn Greenwald is now, I'd say, substantially more right wing than Sam Harris is.
I think we should cry havoc and do Steven Pinker. I think we should jump right in. He's a surprisingly polarizing figure.
He is, but Matt, you know what that will be? That will just be you saying, "I don't think he's that bad," and then afterwards people say, "Why did you not think he's so bad? He's terrible."
Chris, I have more nuanced takes on that. I have so much nuanced take on Pinker.
Do you like Pinker? Do you like Pinker?
Do I like Pinker? I don't comment on him as a human being. I don't know it, but I did. You know, we talked about this. I read, just to take an example, I read Things Are Getting Better book. What's that?
So it's talking about Harvard psychologist Steven Pinker.
Better
Angels.
No.
Better Angels of Nature.
Oh no, Enlightenment Now. Enlightenment Now. A similar deal. And yeah, you know, it's like, you know, and I've heard all of it, but I read it before I was even on Twitter, and I was like, well, here's a pretty boring book, I guess, but it is showing a bunch of statistics, showing them on a range of dimensions, you know, the grand arc of human history. Things are getting a little bit better. I thought he downplayed the environmental issues and he downplayed inequality, but he sort of waved them away as, like, I took it to just be like a general sort of antidote to the you know, news cycle, which is that you know with what fresh hell is this type thing, where everyone feels like we're on the verge of a catastrophe. So I think that kind of message is reasonably helpful, despite the fact that he has, you know, somewhat complacent neoliberal leanings. So I think people overreact. That's my personal take, and I'm happy to be dumped on for it.
Yeah, no, I don't think Pinker's that, like, I'm not even that bad. I think he's generally.
Right, this is the Decoding the Gurus guys. Chris Kavanaugh talking with Matthew Brown. They're both psychology professors.
He's good. Like, I think he gets sucked into culture war stuff, and Andy is a little bit out of touch as the
It's very out of touch.
you know, it's the bomb. CRT is the bomb, apparently. But,
That's what the kids are saying now.
yeah, it's very bad. But he's like Hans Rosling had a book called Factfulness that was essentially the exact same points as Pinker made, and it got much less like blowback or attention. I did actually see some like criticisms of it, but I think like Hans Rosling is somebody that's generally unobjectionable, and he's dead now, so there's not any call to revise him. But I think if you don't have that much of a problem with what Hans Rosling is saying, I really don't think you have that much issue with Pinker. But there is the fact that Pinker has like flirted with race realism stuff with Linda Gottfredson and some comments in his earlier work. So I think that also raises people's hackles. Like,
yeah, look,
yeah,
I think that'll play the case where there's a lack of decoupling. Like people know that he's a sort of they know his political angle. They know the other things he said that they don't like him for. So it's like zero charity extended on things. And yeah, I think you can hand it to him on some things and disagree with him on other things. They don't have to be like all good or all bad.
No. Yeah, I agree, and but that isn't how the internet works, Matt. So
yes, I know.
Yeah, he's yeah, but he is. It's like it's surprising how much emotion he evokes in people for. Like he's wrote a book. I haven't read it. My guess is it's like saying what he usually says, which is science is good and like gradual progress is good and whatever. And like the way that Twitter is acting, it's like he's written a book, Mein Kampf for rationalists or something. Yeah, but maybe he's just a fun person to dunk on.
He is a fun person to dunk on. That's true. But we're probably talking too much. We should let people have a chance to give their comments, tell us things that they didn't like or did like, or ask questions or anything.
Tell us what to do in the next 12 months. Yeah, so Jimmy Dore. Look, Matt, that's another vote, by the way. I want to do Jimmy Dore. So after we get through these next couple episodes, we will go there. But Kristen or...
Okay, here's a little commentary on your friend of mine, Mikhaila Peterson.
Like the fact that she can exist as somebody with a following when all she's doing is telling people to eat meat. Like that in itself speaks of something important. That like Peterson next, and yeah, there's not much there when it comes. Like the thing is, the reaction. Some people asked her to cover it, but like Matt and I've listened to a couple of her things, and there isn't that much really to talk about. But I still think she's good to cover because it's kind of like the fact that she can exist as somebody with a following when all she's doing is telling people to eat meat. Like that in itself speaks of something important. That like it's because her followers Jordan Peterson, right? That's the sole reason. But that's it. Her followers Jordan Peterson, so she can get thousands of people to follow her to say like eat meat.
Pay her to do that.
She's just yeah, but she's not very curious. She's just a girl who likes meat and salt and water. That's the diet.
That's what the episode is mainly going to consist of. Just like she likes.
But maybe not a great choice. Some people prefer it.
I still think it's really good because she has like an ecosystem, as you said, of people who like other foods, like one specific type of meat, or somebody who likes one other type of food. So it's like you wouldn't imagine that people could have a persona just around I like one type of meat, but yeah, here we are.
Yes, Steven Pinker believes different people's different gifts. He is Mein Kampf for rationalists. I thought that was just a great description. Steven Pinker, Mein Kampf for rationalists. Now, there are people in the world who dismiss and denigrate and deride Bazball. But that is not what we do on this channel. The English cricket team is playing an incredibly exciting new version of cricket.
Sorry, I can't find it. Here we go. Harsha. England Bazball is a disgrace to Test cricket. What? They're winning Test matches, so to begin with, that's the aim. So well done there. They are playing to their strengths because their weaknesses were so glaring that they didn't have a choice. So again, that's really good. They may have changed the game forever. And like the West Indies and like Australia, it's fantastic to see. When you live through a change, I think you really start to appreciate more how incredible it is. They've reinvigorated English Test fans and a lot of neutral Test fans, if we're being honest. How is this a disgrace? Like, I think it's really, I love and it's a bit like, I really enjoyed what they did in white ball cricket as well. I love the batting side of it because I really like the idea of taking chances based on things being in your favor. So yes, it looks silly when Joe Root reverse paddle scoops a ball to Mitchell and is out at slip, but I do like the idea of Joe Root going, well, wait a minute, there's no one back there. If they're bowling wide of off stump, if I keep playing conventional off stump shots, eventually I might actually hit a ball to one of these fielders, or I might slice one there. If I'm going to do that, I might as well take a risk where I know I'm going to hit a boundary. There's a lot of logic to that. Again, when we talk about them Wagner bowling short to them and then backing away and hitting it back down the ground, it's a ridiculous shot. And I'm sure there are going to be occasions when England players are out in test matches playing that shot. But there's also no one at mid-on and mid-off, and they know this guy's going to come in and bowl short to them, right? They are taking educated risks in the way that they play. Their bowling's really interesting. I could have actually done something on that, and I might do a full video on it. But essentially, they are simplifying their bowling plans. And I think because of Broad and Anderson being so smart and being so old and being so experienced and all those different things, I think at times England bowlers had so many different theories. And you see it with Broad especially. We just like, maybe your best ball is being 6'5" and bowling at the top of off stump. You don't need to try all these different things. But it's not how Broad went. But I think they've minimized the kind of options that they have now. And they're just like, okay, we're going to go with this plan, and this plan. And we're going to back them and see how they go. And again, they've gone really well so far. So, I mean, I find it hard to think that I don't know what on earth your problem could be, Harsha. They're winning. It's entertaining and it's smart. It's kind of what Test cricket should be. You talked about Kohli's control percentage.
Right. So if you want to understand cricket strategy, you've got to check out this guy's YouTube channel. Just so many great videos. Jared Kimber. Right? It's absolute gold. Now you're saying, 40, tell me more about Bazball. Stop with all the irrelevant philosophical stuff. I am tired of politics. I am no longer interested in fighting the culture war. I've had it up to here with Donald Trump. Talk to me about Bazball. I demand to know more about Bazball. It's just overwhelming reaction of my audience. Just so tired of the trivial religious moral issues. People want to know about Bazball. What the hell is Bazball? All right. Bazball, after the English coach, Brendan Baz McCullum from New Zealand. Right. So normally Test cricket is a conservative game, takes place over 5 days, rewards patience, defensive technique, and temperamental fortitude. I'm reading from the Indian Express. Over flair, bravado, and innovation. Look, I am traumatized right now. I was trying to go to sleep last night. I thought I'd watch a little bit of day 3 of the second test between Australia and India. And Australia was looking good. They had just lost 2 wickets. They had 82 runs on the board. All right. They were 1 run ahead after each team had batted in the first innings. And then in the course of an hour, they lose 8 wickets. They are bowled out for like 114 runs. And they just get absolutely slaughtered in the second test match in a row by India, which just devastates my sleep. Like, how am I supposed to sleep when 5 Australian batsmen in their second innings get out trying to sweep the ball? And then you expect me to sleep and carry on like a productive citizen when the Australian cricket team is just an absolute disgrace? Like when Alan Border was the captain, he would never put up with this nonsense. I don't see why you start sweeping the ball on an unpredictable wicket if you're going to be sweeping the ball right in front of your own your own sticks, all right, in front of your own wicket, and the pitch is turning and unpredictable, and you're sweeping. 5 Australian batsmen got out sweeping. It's just, there were 4 Australian wickets fell without them scoring 1 run. All right, so Test cricket, conservative game, thought to reward patience, defensive technique, and temperamental fortitude over flair, bravado, and innovation. Right, like this show. I mean, this is a show that rewards patience, defensive technique, and temperamental fortitude. Leave it to PPP and the Keno Casino to give you all the flair, bravado, and innovation that you might want. Right, so this is a show that, like a good Test cricket batsman, is supposed to last long. I just grind my opposition out. The value of a wicket is paramount. The aim of the batter is to stay on the pitch for as long as possible. Amassing runs off risk-free shots. It's the bowler's job to attack, to take wickets, and move the game closer to its conclusion. Right, as a test match is concluded, generally speaking, when both sides have gotten to bat twice. So Bazball is a novel approach that tries to shed some of cricket's long-standing assumptions about how to play, specifically the approach to batting. So instead of trying to preserve wickets, Brendan McCullum directed the English players to go for it, scoring as quickly as possible. Right, so wickets are inevitable in cricket, regardless of the approach a batter takes. The right ball can beat even the best player with the most solid defense. Hence, it is logical to try to maximize scoring before that one unplayable delivery arrives. So by attacking the bowlers, who are traditionally the aggressors in the long format of Test cricket, batters cause chaos. They put immense pressure on bowling teams, which then are more likely to make mistakes. So Bazball runs the risk of batting teams losing quick wickets and falling for a paltry score, but when it works, it takes them to a winning position. So it's been a while since England's had a really good Test cricket team. It's been a while since it had a batting lineup that can consistently win games. Now, we have Bazball. England is playing the most exciting cricket in the world right now, and we've got the Ashes coming up with Australia touring England coming up in June. So England's white ball, meaning Test cricket teams, have undergone a revolution after a disastrous 2015 World Cup in the T20 format. England has completely overhauled their white ball setup is T20. Sorry. So they become very aggressive with the T20 game, which is just 20 overs, takes about 3 hours, opposed to Test cricket match is 5 days. So they play a Test cricket match with the red ball. White ball is T20, the 3-hour version, or the 1-day version, which is really like an 8-hour version, 50 overs each. So Bazball borrows a leaf from the England shorter setup. So it's cognizant of the limitations of England's Test talent batting pool, place the strengths of the players available, the emphasis on using their T20 and 1-day skills and scoring intent in Test match cricket to gain an advantage in a way never before seen in Test cricket. So England is scoring more runs at a faster rate than we've ever seen before. Now, can this work long term? So you have a former Indian cricketer saying South Africa shows that Bazball doesn't work against a world-class bowling attack with a variety and a sharp captain who sets smart fields. So other people say the pitches that England has played on have been tailor-made for their belligerent brand of cricket. The best Test cricket teams play in a variety of ways. They attack when the time is right. They defend when they have to. So this is a flexibility of method is crucial for consistency against different types of teams in different conditions. So a gung-ho attack so far helped England more than not. So they've been abandoning cricket's old dogmatism. So what he's trying to do is get failure out of your mind. Just go for it, mate. Sort of like, who's our friend? Who's our friend who's dying? All right, the bloke who's so good with the blood sports and the videos, Mr. Matica, all right? So he was asked for life advice, and he said, go for it. Failure is an unavoidable part of life and a part of sport. Bazball has seen some failure. It will see some more, often spectacularly so, due to its all-or-nothing approach. When batters are willing to play aggressive shots, they inherently court failure at a much higher rate, but aggressive shots also court more runs. So Bazball is not just a way to play Test cricket. It's a philosophy of life. Right? English cricketing culture hates failure. Now we've got something exciting. Failure inevitably comes. The knives will inevitably come out. But his whole way of playing is to not care.
I think players like Pujara and Kohli who play extremely defensively will definitely have a high control percentage, but will face more unplayable balls. Well, they won't face more unplayable balls because that doesn't change what the bowlers do. And Kohli isn't a defensive player. He's nowhere near one of the more defensive players around.
That's the
I mean, he hasn't scored a lot of recent times
Indian
because he hasn't scored a lot. But his first class record.
Oh man,
he's played Test cricket, hasn't he? His Test record. So his strike rate is 55. That is anything above 50 is certainly not defensive. Between 45 and 50, you could be a strike rater like Alistair Cook.
All right, Jared Kimber there, a little cricket analysis. All right, Robert Wright here talking to Mickey
Hey,
Mouse.
let me just say, you're right. We lowered our radar threshold for detecting things because naturally we're usually set up to detect things that move at the speed of missiles and are the size of missiles and the shape of missiles and so on. Fine. And they decided to lower the threshold, but that's exactly the reason they shouldn't have been shooting him down gratuitously. They should have said to themselves, so this probably means we're going to see some things we haven't noticed before, which probably, and besides, there is no scenario in which these things are actually an immediate threat. So the last fucking thing we should do is shoot them down unless we're really freaking out. It is completely inexcusable.
It's also it's not directed against China. It's for domestic political consumption. So how does it hurt China to shoot down the hobbyist weather balloon? Does it?
Well, to the extent that it is for domestic consumption, which part of the overreaction to the Chinese balloon was as well, I want to connect this to the Ukraine war. These guys are terrified of somebody questioning their manhood. This is a long-standing problem with Democrats. They haven't even, even though half the Republican Party now claims it's like on the restrainer side, which is usually not true. But anyway, even though
the poll numbers are amazing, the number of Republicans who oppose aid to Ukraine. I think it's a majority, and it's amazing the number of Americans that oppose aid to Ukraine. It's in trouble politically.
That's interesting.
More than I'm for aid in Ukraine, so I'm sort of horrified by it. But
let me just quickly finish. If you ask why, we still don't know if pre-invasion diplomacy could have averted this whole war. But if you ask, why didn't the Biden administration even try? And by their own account, they didn't. Go look up Derek Chollet, the State Department counselor, and what he said. They made nothing that they could have thought Putin would actually consider a serious attempt at diplomacy. If you ask why they didn't, I think it's fear of people questioning their manhood.
Is that what Bennett said too? Naftali Bennett? Did he say it was for domestic
I don't think he had a theory. He didn't even quite pin it on Biden. He was ambiguous about which Western leader it is, but clearly we were running the show. He was talking about us. But I'm serious. Look, a responsible president in a situation like that doesn't bow to perceived political pressure. And I think that's what they did. It's this long-standing fear in the Democratic Party. And what the world needs is a president of the United States who, when it comes to foreign policy, just says, I'm going to do the right thing. And if they don't reelect me, that's life.
I think Biden seems especially sort of ploddingly sensitive to the politics of it. I think he realizes it's a 51-49 country and he can't lose 2%. So he has this sort of heightened fear. But in part, it's just I don't understand it. It was true under Obama too. I mean, Shirley Sherrod gives this speech, which the excerpt that Breitbart runs seems to imply that she's happy she didn't do right by a white farmer, and they fire her that day. They can't afford a second news cycle. They can't afford a second news cycle where they would find out that she later went on to say that she had been wrong, and of course she should help the white farmer.
Now that was embarrassing.
They always fire them within one news cycle.
Now remember the guy who got fired. The guy in D.C. This was local politics, but he got fired for using the word niggardly, which is a word that has nothing in common etymologically with the N-word.
But that was a DC government. That was
a local thing,
and that dragged on for a few days. I think
his job didn't. I don't think. But
the whole point of this is that they don't want it to drag on for 3 days. They want to can the person today and only have one news cycle.
We need politicians who are made.
But if you had a politician who was 60-40 favorable, they would be in a much stronger position. They wouldn't have to do that.
Yeah, but see, my theory is America, secretly or maybe not so secretly, hungers for somebody who really looks like they're going to say, like they mean it when they say, look, I'm going to do what I think is right. I actually think it would play well if they kind of made a thing of it. If they just said, I know this is unpopular, I'm doing it,
politicians do that every now and then. McCain did it. Bruce Babbitt did it. Look where it got him. I think Clinton even did it at some point. So he delivered the tough medicine to the ship workers, saying that these manufacturing jobs aren't coming back. Boy, does that not sit well with the public now, since they're desperate to have those manufacturing jobs back. But at the time, it was considered, he was laying on straight, giving them the tough love news. So, what you said about 60-40 politicians, can I use that transition?
Yes, especially since you're the one who said it. Yeah.
Right. Okay.
Nice setup. That was an excellent setup.
Okay. Sorry. I set myself up. The Fetterman announced that he's, in treatment for clinical depression.
Mm-hmm.
I assume this means he won't be voting.
I wondered about that.
So that Joe Manchin is back in the saddle in the Senate. But I don't think there are any huge votes planned for the next few weeks when he's going to be in the hospital. And of course, they weren't transparent. They're getting praise for their transparency now, but they weren't transparent before November 8th. When he could easily have, the Democrats could have said, okay, your wife runs, you can run when you can take over.
He wasn't clinically depressed then, presumably.
No, apparently he was.
He was a recovering stroke patient.
It was apparently the depression was mixed up with stroke recovery. If you read the New York Times story today.
You mean he was depressed before the election?
Yeah, it was a mixture of depression and stroke recovery. It was there were signs of depression before the election. Yes.
Do we know how the stroke recovery per se is proceeding? Has he gotten better at all?
I don't know. The Times story says that maybe by continuing to run and not dropping out, he set back his recovery. I don't know about stroke recoveries at all, except that strokes are a bad thing because if you have one stroke, you're more apt to have another stroke. But there are a lot of people who recover and then don't have another stroke. So why couldn't he be one of them? So I don't know. I assume the recovery is now mixed up with the depression, so it's hard to tell how it's going, right?
Yeah.
But the point is, I think the story is not about Fetterman, it's about Biden, because it shows that if you let possible medical risks, if you say, okay, it's all going to turn out, we're going to ignore this medical risk, sometimes you get burned and the medical risk comes to fruition. Biden had this. I think the testimony of the State of the Union is sort of hard to rebut. He seemed all there, and whatever drug they gave him worked that day, and then I guess it wears off. But
also, a drug that will get you through a speech, even if there's a couple of ad libs in response to hecklers, is not the same as a drug that will get you through a debate with Ron DeSantis, or even maybe Trump.
Oh, I think the Biden of the State of the Union could have gotten through a debate with Ron DeSantis.
Mickey, give me a speech. Come on, a debate is a totally different game. Are you kidding?
I thought you were going to say it's not going to get into a day of hard policy making, but you don't care about that.
No, I care.
I know you care. You care that you want to talk about the.
Okay, so that shooter in Pico Robertson who hated Jews apparently because he blamed Persian Jews for the spread of COVID. Apparently, this guy was influenced by the Goyim Defense League. So on successive days, he shot Jewish men walking out of synagogue. He was expelled from dental school after distributing Goyim Defense League flyers blaming COVID on Jews. So he's been homeless for a year. He sent hundreds of anti-Semitic messages to his fellow classmates, continuing to threaten them. So there is a subset of people who just, hate Jews or hate, high achieving groups because they're losers, right? This guy, homeless for a year, sent hundreds of anti-Semitic messages to his fellow classmates, continuing to threaten them. And he was arrested for felony possession of a firearm and also making numerous threats to kill people. But the Los Angeles district attorney released him without bond, without bail, and he goes off and shoots 2 Jews leaving their synagogue prayer service. So if LA District Attorney George Gascon had not been so lenient with a man obsessed with hating Jews, 2 Jews would not have been shot. Can they pursue, these men who were shot, can they pursue legal charges against our DA, George Gascon, for failing to protect the people of Los Angeles and putting his radical policies over public safety? So the Democrats are all about gun control for Republicans, but they're not nearly as interested in enforcing laws for regulating who can possess firearms against their own voters. And as a result, hundreds of people are getting slaughtered. Let's get some Mickey Kaus here on Tupac. Probably wondering, what does Mickey think about Tupac Shakur?
Of the Philip Marlowe character.
As if the world needed that.
That's my question. I mean, this is genre busting for the sake of genre busting. I mean, I think that's why I didn't like Breathless. Is like, what's the point of this? If I don't find it amusing and entertaining in its own right, I'm afraid I don't have time for this. And some people do, I guess. But did you ever watch the rest of The Long Goodbye?
Not yet, no.
You still don't know the surprise ending, so I won't mention
Don't know the surprise ending.
Okay.
I'm afraid I've been lured away by slow horses.
Well, check out the hip. Do you have the PBS?
So I've been rewatching the great HBO show Winning Time. I read the book twice, Showtime, about the Los Angeles Lakers of the 1980s by Jeff Pullman. Everything he writes is so compelling. And I'm just about to read his new book on Bo Jackson, the great Oakland Raiders running back who also played Major League Baseball. Just a phenomenon of the mid 1980s. But Winning Time's the HBO adaptation of the Jeff Pullman book on the 1980 Los Angeles Lakers. It is so good. I'm watching it for the second time.
That's like app or streaming app or whatever. I think you can get it for free.
Okay.
The PBS channel. You should check out the hip hop thing. You'd find that interesting, right? We could talk about it.
Whoa! I got a $10 super chat, but I got a really sincere compliment. Thank you, Luke. I read your blog about your dad passing in 2019. It was very moving. I don't know any other live streamer who would share so much about their life. You're a wise and honest man. Thank you. Well, thank you. So my not very nice reaction, dominant reaction, not just to my dad's passing, but also several other people I've known, such as Mark Kramer, an eccentric writer out of New York. My immediate reaction was one of relief. I wasn't close with my father. I just felt, that was the primary thing I felt was relief. And some other difficult people I've had in my life, when I found out that they died, my primary reaction was relief.
I have watched the film Biggie and Tupac by Nick Broomfield.
See, I'm wondering how they'll handle the Tupac. I assume they'll get into the killing and everything, right? They have to.
Well, yes, but there's so many mysteries around that. They'd have to adopt one theory or the other.
Yeah.
The thing about Tupac is that I hate about him is he's basically a middle class guy who taught himself to be a thug. Yeah. No, we want people. I mean, there's this whole horrible strain of hip hop where it's an outgrowth. It's similar to identity politics. If you become a normal middle class integrated American, you're betraying your race and your roots, and
right.
And that's bad. So Tupac was on the way to becoming a normal middle class American and wanted to be the Frank Sinatra of hip hop, had to adopt sluggish ways just to give himself authenticity. That's not the way you want to go in the other direction. You want to stop being thuggish. And
so do we know why he was killed? There was some kind of East-West dispute. There was like East Coast powers in the hip hop world and West Coast powers or something.
Yes.
And what happened?
Biggie was an East Coaster. He'd been killed on the West Coast. So the question was this a
wait? Biggie Smalls was killed too.
Yeah, he's been dead for years.
So he was murdered first.
He was murdered first, I think.
And he was
murdered outside the Peterson Auto Museum here down the road.
And do we know why?
No, I don't. The film. But everybody's very suspicious of Suge Knight, the head of Death Row Records, who is actually, he was on trial for a murder. I don't know what happened to him. He may have been convicted for another murder, but is obviously very thuggish. And so he might have. I think there's a theory that he murdered both of them. there's a really weird theory that even though he was riding in the car with Tupac when Tupac was shot and killed, that he ordered the hit. And he just said, aim carefully, don't hit me, hit Tupac. Which would be a pretty ballsy thing to do. I think Connie Bruck's piece in the New Yorker suggested that Suge Knight was behind it. This movie by Nick Broomfield opened, there were two mind-blowing aspects to it. One, it opened a window in this whole world of LA black ex-cops who had a sort of a network, and they were all really good looking, really smart, and completely amoral. And it was just terrifying. So they could have done it. They provided protection to people. And the other thing is it had an interview with Suge Knight in San Quentin, not San Quentin, whatever prison he was in, maybe San Quentin, very tough prison. And he goes, and so he goes to interview Suge Knight in prison, and his cameraman is scared to show up. So the cameraman doesn't show up. So he's carrying the camera himself. And he's scared to go ask Suge Knight for the interview. So the warden says, okay, I'll go and negotiate for you. And he goes over, talks to Suge Knight, comes back and says, okay, Suge will talk to you if you let him give his message to the kids at the end of your interview. And so Broomfield says, okay. And then they have the interview. At the end of the interview, and Broomfield says, okay, you can give your message to the kids now. So Suge Knight says, you know that Snoop Dogg? He's walking around on the streets a free man. You know the cops wouldn't let him do that unless he was a stool pigeon. And you know what we do to stool pigeons, don't you, kids?
And they published that? I mean, it
well,
wasn't
no,
live.
that's part of the movie. He agreed. That was it's incredibly revealing. You put it in your movie too.
Well, but
in addition to being kind of hilarious.
But aren't you kind of responsible if anything happens to the guy?
True, but he's
no, you're not responsible. You're not primarily responsible. If something happens to the guy, that's primarily on the people who do the bad thing. But you're not without any responsibility. Okay, let's think a little bit about the temptations of Carl Schmitt.
Schmitt's own ethnocultural conception of the friend-enemy distinction would itself be more than sufficient to help push Germany into denying humanity to its enemies, and so ultimately seeking their total annihilation. In his public writings before 1933, the enemy that Schmitt portrayed as facing Germany and the Germans was always communism and the Bolsheviks. Schmitt would forever maintain that his mission had merely been to protect the constitutional state and to save Europe from the Russian danger, which was the greatest external threat to Germany. But as in the minds of many Germans,
right, you may think you hate Group A, but if Group B becomes more of a threat to you than Group A, then Group A will fade from your mind. Right, the enemy is he who threatens your very existence. And when such an enemy rises into view, all other considerations have to take a backseat.
Of the time, Schmitt's view of the communist threat and the seemingly complicit weakness of liberalism began to blur together over the course of the 1920s with what he perceived to be an even greater, if more shadowy, enemy, the transnational Jew. Schmitt had always feared and hated Jews, and admired them for their success, and despised himself for admiring them. He agonized in his diary over his Jewish complex, feeling an inadequate pleb compared to his Jewish academic colleagues, but simultaneously superior to them, and cheated out of proper recognition and status while working in their shadow.
Oh, that sounds really, really bad. But all those emotions, many Jews have them too.
Which was the greatest external threat to Germany. But, as in the minds of many Germans of the time, Schmitt's view of the communist threat and the seemingly complicit weakness of liberalism began to blur together over the course of the 1920s with what he perceived to be an even greater, if more shadowy, enemy, the transnational Jew. Schmitt had always feared and hated Jews.
Yeah, and guess what? There are Jews who have always feared and hated non-Jews.
And admired them for their success.
Yes, and there have been Jews who've admired non-Jews for their success.
And despised himself for admiring them.
And there are Jews who have despised themselves for admiring non-Jews. So this isn't something, that's complex and unique just to Carl Schmitt.
He agonized in his diary over his Jewish complex.
Guess what? Plenty of Jews have agonized over their Goyim complex.
Feeling an inadequate pleb compared to his Jewish academic colleagues.
And plenty of Jews have felt inadequate compared to their non-Jewish colleagues.
But simultaneously superior to them.
And plenty of Jews who have simultaneously felt inadequate compared to non-Jews around them, but simultaneously feeling superior to them. Right? We're complicated.
And cheated out of proper recognition and status.
Yeah, and plenty of Jews have felt cheated out of their proper recognition and status while working in the shadow of the Goyim.
While working in their shadow. He felt constantly persecuted. The Jews attacked.
Yeah, many people feel constantly persecuted.
Attack me in all the journals, and no one notices what is going on, he raged in 1925.
Yeah, and plenty of Jews have felt like, the non-Jews, the Goyim, constantly attacking me. No one notices what's going on.
He worked to sabotage the advancement of Jewish professors at the universities where he held positions, writing to savage the candidacy of one disgusting, craven dilettante Jew before he could be appointed alongside him at the University of Bonn, for instance. He left Bonn for Berlin in 1928, in part because he wanted to escape all of the Jews that lurked there, allegedly holding him down, and find a clean life somewhere free from them.
And is it possible that there were some important Jews there who were working against his career interests?
His Jewish complex seems to have been at least in part related to his near-constant money troubles. Much of his work was prestigious but unpaid, and he was a hopeless spendthrift.
Yeah, this is kind of taking the assumption that there weren't some fundamental conflicts of interest between German Jews and German non-Jews. Right? I'm not an expert on Weimar Germany, but there may indeed have been fundamental group conflicts. It may not just have been psychological illness that compelled Carl Schmitt to think as he did.
He was constantly in debt, to the point that he more than once recorded thoughts of escape through suicide.
Yeah, a lot of people have thought about escape through suicide from their debts. A lot of people have thought about, offing themselves. Life is hard.
He came to fear and loathe financiers, whom he considered analogous with Jews. He perpetually labored under the weight of a fear of the Jews, fear of my debts, as he recorded in his diary on April 29, 1929. By the end of 1932, he had become radically anti-Semitic, beginning to sever all contact with his former Jewish students and friends, such as the young Leo Strauss, whose work on Hobbes he had once said he found a pure joy to read.
And guess what? There are plenty of Jews who have, say, become Orthodox Jews who have then severed all contact, meaningful contact with non-Jews. For example, if you are an observant Orthodox Jew, it's difficult to eat and drink and fraternize with non-Jews. So it's not surprising that people go through stages in their life where they are more or less open to outgroups.
His work would soon begin to frame the Germans' enemy as something well beyond the communists and the Russians. The German nation was now engaged in an existential battle against the Jewish spirit. It was a view that he would retain for the rest of his life. As he noted in his personal diaries well after World War II was over, and Nuremberg was behind him, his fundamental conclusion was that Jews always remain Jews.
And that's the fundamental worldview of traditional Jews, that Jews always remain Jews, no matter how outwardly assimilist.
While a communist can improve and change, the true enemy is the assimilated Jew. Ultimately, Schmitt seemed...
So the founder of the American Nazi Party, blanking on his name, he had no problem with Orthodox Jews. It was the assimilated communist Jew that he had a problem with.
Seems to have understood the consequences of the politics advanced by his friend-enemy distinction quite well. The idea of ethnic identity, he predicted in 1933, will pervade and dominate all our public law.
Well, ethnic identity, blood-based identity has dominated human identity for thousands of years. It's not something that just developed in 1933 Germany.
He joined the Nazi Party the same year.
Yeah, after the Nazis took power, and the best way to get ahead was to associate with the Nazis. But about 3 years previous, he was all for banning the Nazi Party and banning the Communist Party. So people have different perspectives depending on changing circumstances and internal changes.
Secularizing the theological. Despite its fame, the concept of the political is arguably not the work most important to understanding the true spirit of Carl Schmitt. That distinction may instead fall to a lecture he delivered in Spain in 1929 titled The Age of Neutralizations and Depoliticizations, which consolidated the key ideas he had been drawing on for at least a decade. The lecture, which Schmitt later had appended to the end of the 1932 edition of The Concept of the Political, is short but to the point. He argues that over the previous half-millennium the West has gone through a series of phases, each roughly a century long, in which the central domain animating human society, and which constituted Europeans' concept of truth, italics in the original, shifted to take on a specific overarching character. The 16th century was fundamentally structured around the theological, with God and the scriptures still core to the spirit of the age.
Yeah, but scriptures and God were much less important to Europe in the 16th century than they were, say, in the 11th century. So Europe was steadily secularizing from about the 10th century onwards.
The 17th century, the century of Hobbes, not only metaphysically but also scientifically the greatest age of Europe, then shifted to center a metaphysical outlook, a heroic Occidental rationalism, as its core organizing principle. Then the 18th century, a vulgarization on a grand scale, jettisoned metaphysics for Enlightenment-based rationalism and humanitarian moralism. And in the 19th century, economic thinking came to dominate, propelling the clash between bourgeois liberalism and Marxism to the forefront.
Well, I think it's nationalism that came to dominate in the 19th century more than capitalism.
Finally, Schmitt believed the 20th century had begun to make technology the central domain. Of these transitions, Schmitt considered the strongest and most consequential of all to be the one in the 17th century from the traditional Christian theology to natural science, given that, until now, this shift has determined the direction of all further development. After that point, in the metaphysics of 18th century deism, God himself was removed from the world and reduced to a neutral instance. He became a concept and ceased to be an essence. And with God's sovereignty removed subsequently, first the monarch and then the state became a neutral power, initiating a chapter in the history of political theology of the liberal neutral state, in which the process of neutralization finds its classical formula, because it also has grasped what is most decisive, political power. What ties all of these centuries together for Schmitt is thus that their consistent elemental impulse was the striving for a neutral domain. In every case, Westerners sought to distance themselves from past conflict and struggle and moved in the direction of neutralization and minimalization of the political.
And that's what's still going on. That's very much the direction of liberalism, which dominates most of our institutions.
Hence why ours is an age of neutralizations and depoliticizations, and why now in reality, as he famously claimed in Political Theology 1922, all significant concepts of the modern theory of the state are secularized theological concepts. Schmitt believed this secularization had reached its peak with the dawn of the 20th century, when there arose a religion of technological progress, which promised all other problems would be solved by technological progress, and the people of the industrialized West turned the belief in miracles and the afterlife into a religion of technical miracles, human achievements, and the domination of nature. Thus, a magical religiosity became an equally magical technicity. The 20th century began as the age not only of technology, but of a religious belief in technology. Moreover, this contemporary belief in the technological was based on the proposition that the absolute and ultimate neutral ground has been found in technology, providing a chance to finally achieve perpetual peace in the age of technicity. This trend of secularization and neutralization is one that Schmitt, a man transparently nostalgic for Hobbes' Age of Kings, viewed with disgust and concern, and which he seems to have spent his entire adult life wrestling with. In political theology, he had explored how politics had been depersonalized, sovereignty having been steadily removed, first from the divine and then from the monarch, making genuine political decisions more and more difficult. Worse, he wrote with horror, the kind of economic technical thinking that prevails today is no longer capable of perceiving a political idea at all, threatening to transform the state into merely a sort of huge industrial plant, as previously envisioned by his countryman Max Weber. Today, nothing is more modern than the onslaught against the political, Schmitt lamented. There must no longer be political problems, only organizational, technical, and economic sociological ones. With the loss of the political, modern life was losing touch with the realm of the human, and therefore all of its meaning.
Yeah, this rings pretty true.
Thus, for Schmitt, like for so many today, the deepest problem of life was fundamentally the question of how to deal with what Weber had described as modernity's demagification of the world.
Right, these are themes that I return to again and again.
In Zauberung der Welt, Schmitt would, over the course of his intellectual career, seek in all the worst places for a way to re-enchant that world. This was a quest that likely would have been quite a bit simpler and more productive if, for Schmitt, God hadn't been dead. Schmitt would, until his dying day, vociferously defend himself as having always remained a lifelong Catholic Christian. I find this doubtful. Though raised in the church and by all accounts a devout believer in his early years, something in Schmitt's interior life seems to have begun to shift around 1914, when his diary entries started to hint at a crisis of faith. He had just been engaged to be married very young. It already wasn't going well, and he was already broke. As the Great War began and he lost a close friend, he found himself in a dark place. Where should I seek refuge? He asked himself, answering, in the Catholic Church. But I can't. Instead, he cries for advice and help from the quiet, unknown gods, and describes himself as a Gnostic who could at most believe in a malicious creator of this world. Simultaneously, he wrote, as if determined to delight every future left-wing would-be psychoanalyst, that he felt the awakening of a misogynist complex within himself. How long these particular sentiments lasted is unclear. But not long after this wartime crisis, a new obstacle would increasingly begin to wedge itself between Schmitt and his relationship with the church, a compulsive, out-of-control sexuality.
Right, and this doesn't come from nowhere. I've certainly had long periods of compulsive, out-of-control sexuality, and it fundamentally comes from a lack of normal human connection. Right, when I have had a normal, healthy level of human connection, I have not been lost in my addictions. But when you don't have those normal human bonds, and you may feel somewhat like you're flailing in life, then we all need to feel comfort. And sexual release for some people like me was incredibly comforting. Other people turn to drugs. Other people turn to alcohol. Other people turn to extreme religion. Other people watch a lot of TV or play video games. But if you're not connecting normally with other people, you're going to have to connect with something, be it a substance or a process. And these, unhealthy forms of connection tend you to lead one in a downward spiral. That was certainly my experience.
Schmitt's married life was characterized by a continuous series of passionate affairs, conducted in the form of almost daily trysts in parks, trains, secluded paths, and other semi-public places that he noted afforded him a particular thrill.
Yes, he was living in an erotic state of exception.
To this was added a countless stream of prostitutes, to whom seems to have gone much of his money, plus all of the family maids. He describes his deranged sexuality as having transformed him into a kind of maniac, unable to keep himself from following women around in public places, as if hypnotized. He diligently kept an exact diary of each of his ejaculations. November 3rd, 1926, ejaculation. But it wasn't a release.
Now, why is this so odd? I'm sure that most people watching the show right now keep a very precise diary of each of their ejaculations. Seems like a very healthy preoccupation.
No release without conquest, this behavior would, to his shame, continue even while his second wife was critically ill with tuberculosis. To the reader, his decision to write a doctoral thesis.
Why do people think that men should stop banging if their wife gets cancer or their wife becomes critically ill? And oh, how shocking that he would patronize prostitutes while his wife is critically ill. Right? If a man's not having sex with his wife and the man has a compulsive need for sex, that he is going to patronize prostitutes. He's not going to hold back and say, oh, I should not have an orgasm. I should not do the one thing that brings me comfort and peace. Right? I should not do my favorite thing in the whole world because my wife's got cancer. Therefore, I'm just going to abstain. Right? You'd have to be a righteous man in master of your domain to be able to pull that off.
Thesis on the topic of guilt seems to take on new significance. It was his troubled relationships with women that estranged him from the church and from Christianity.
Yeah, when I started becoming sexually curious about age 8, right, that's when I started distancing from my childhood dream of becoming a Christian missionary. So the more important sex came to me, the less important God and religion. And then that led me into a downward spiral. So I woke up from that downward spiral in 1989, realized I was in trouble, and I saw Judaism as kind of a lifeboat, and I paddled towards Judaism thinking that that could save me from my destructive downward spiral into sexual obsession.
In 1912, young Schmitt met a Spanish dancer in a vaudeville theater who spun him a tale of being the runaway daughter of an aristocratic Croatian lord. Seduced, he defied the advice of all friends and family and married her in 1915.
Yeah, if you're a sex and love addict, the power to make wise decisions with regard to sex and love does not reside within you. If you are an under-earner, the power to make wise decisions with regard to earning does not reside with you. If you are an alcoholic, The power to make wise decisions regarding the use of alcohol does not reside in you.
When she eventually turned out to be neither an aristocrat nor Croatian, but an illegitimate kleptomaniac scamstress from Munich, Schmitt filed for divorce.
Shocking. So what's the old saw I think I heard from one rabbi? Every man gets married and thinks he's going to bed with Rachel, but he wakes up in the morning next to Rachel, right? So like Jacob in the book of Genesis, he thinks he's marrying Rachel, but his father-in-law has tricked him, and he's instead being stuck with the woman with weak eyes. And he has to work an extra 7 years to marry the woman that he wants. So yeah, every man gets married thinking he's going to go to bed with Rachel, but he ends up, waking up with Leah. I mean, there is that profound, if you're not in a good, solid, loving relationship with a woman and you go to bed with someone who's, say, severely lacking in many areas, there is a feeling of contempt and just grossness and disgust that overwhelms one. I remember there was this very plain, homely woman, and somehow she seduced me. And when it was finished, I just couldn't wait to get out of there. And then the next morning, she calls me because she's been in an auto accident. So being an old-fashioned Victorian gentleman, I drive over and I pick her up and I take her to the hospital and I look after her. But every fiber of my being just wanted to run. It's like, how on earth did I go to bed with this woman? Oh, and then sometimes I bang some quite fat women, and my friend said, I lost all respect for you, knowing that you banged that ugly fat woman. God forbid that they employed such lookism.
A civil court in Bonn granted the divorce in 1924, but his attempt to convince the church to annul the marriage failed, an event that left Schmitt filled with great shame and anger. He appealed, but that process had not yet concluded before he'd already fallen for and married the secretary who'd filed his divorce papers. For this act, Schmitt was officially excommunicated from the Catholic Church in 19...
Yeah, I think we've all married the secretary who files our divorce papers. It's a very, very common problem for men.
1926. I am completely done with Christianity, he recorded in his diary. From this point forward, Schmitt would abandon a lingering academic interest in experimenting with integrating the religious community of the church as a balancing force between people and ruler, a position he had struck in 1923 in Roman Catholicism and political form. He would instead go in search of new gods.
And the chat says, look, there was a decision. Ron Jeremy was found not capable of standing trial for rape allegations because of his dementia. So without any knowledge to the contrary, I suspect he really does have dementia. I believe that he really did rape women, and that's what I think. So what the news says in this instance is what I think is true.
And he would find them in technology, in the state, and in the Führer. At the heart of Schmitt's lecture on the age of neutralizations and depoliticizations was a warning to his fellow Germans. While it might be understandable that to most people, technology appeared to be neutral due to its universal usability, and therefore to be a domain of peace, understanding, and reconciliation, this was an illusion. Technology, he said, is always only an instrument and a weapon. Precisely because it serves all, it is not neutral. Like in every previous era, the central domain of technology would be put to use by the political, whether the political was recognized to exist or not.
And people wanted me to comment on the new Tucker Carlson, Sean Hannity text, which showed that they didn't really believe Donald Trump's claims about a stolen election, but they were most concerned with learning viewers. And a friend says, are you surprised? Come on, are you so surprised that they're as cynical as that? No, I'm not surprised, but it is compelling to see these texts just spelled out. So here's the...
I want to rewind now back to November 2020, election night. Millions of people were watching Fox News when it became the first major network to project Joe Biden, not Donald Trump, had won the key state of Arizona in the presidential race. It was the right call, but it threw the network into a crisis. We're learning vivid new details now about how that crisis played out thanks to legal filings in a blockbuster defamation lawsuit against Fox. NPR media correspondent David Folkenflik joins us. And good morning, David.
Good morning, Ozma.
So why was Fox News thrown into a panic simply because its journalists correctly called a state that Biden had indeed won?
Well, this isn't about journalistic values at Fox. It's about brand identity. And you don't have to take my word for it. That's what executives, including the chief executive at Fox News, said to one another behind the scenes. Fox viewers, their loyal Trump voters, started bleeding to smaller rival Newsmax. So within days of Election Day, you saw Fox stars beginning to air and seemingly embrace at times conspiracy theories without solid evidence, including that this vote tech company, Dominion Voting Systems, switched Trump votes to Biden. We now know this was incredible hypocrisy. Behind the scenes, the Fox stars and execs were trashing the idea of these allegations and broadcasting them anyway.
Okay, so David, give us an example of what Fox's viewers were encountering.
Well, let's take a listen. Take Fox News' Maria Bartiromo, what she said on November 29th, 2020, to then-President Trump after he alleged on her show that the Dominion machines were engineered to commit fraud against him.
This election was a fraud. It was a rigged election.
This is disgusting, and we cannot allow America's election to be corrupted.
So under oath, Bartiromo conceded to Dominion's lawyers the claims Trump and his camp were relying on lacked any credibility. She called them kooky later on. Fox News repeatedly hosted this Trump ally, an attorney named Sidney Powell, who made wild claims. Tucker Carlson pretty effectively showed she had no proof in his interview of her, but many of his colleagues presented her as a serious figure, even while trashing her in private text to one another. Sean Hannity had her on his show. Privately, he called her and her assertions outlandish.
JFRP, Jean-Francois Garapé, he had no problem pimping Sidney Powell and all these ridiculous allegations of voter fraud. He was on this day in, day out because it's what his audience wanted to hear.
Corporate official at Fox Corp called it mind-blowingly nuts.
Right. So saying what you believe to be true, doing the right thing, isn't always advantageous. You'll get a lot more viewers if you peddle the nonsense that people want to hear. And these Fox hosts, they were primarily concerned about losing viewership and the power and reach of Fox News. So they were quite willing to promote lies. And that's what they did. This is why there are many very serious, very accurate, very powerful critiques of Tucker Carlson. At the same time, Tucker Carlson does a lot of good stuff. So Tucker Carlson, like Donald Trump, for me, is very much a mixed bag. I think overall Tucker does more good than harm, but he does so many horrible things as well.
So, David, this gets to how we know all of this, because Dominion has been making these claims for, about 2 years now. What makes these new details notable?
Well, Dominion lays all of this out in a filing yesterday with all kinds of new evidence they've gained in this process called discovery. And the cynicism and the fear inside Fox News is presented in Technicolor. You have these executives and star hosts who are privately clear-eyed. There's no evidence Dominion committed fraud, none. Yet they're angry, not at the claims, but that at their newsroom colleagues, the journalists, who say that there's no credence to these allegations on the air to Fox viewers and in public. Many of those viewers don't want to hear it. So you had one Fox News reporter accurately fact-checking claims of fraud that appeared on Fox's air in a tweet. Tucker Carlson privately called for her to be fired, and she pulled the tweet down. Oh, wow. In another instance, Fox's CEO privately denounced a top Washington editor for Fox for failing to protect the station's brand.
So how is Fox responding to all of this? What is it saying?
They're saying a few big things. They're saying Dominion's trying to punish it for covering the news for allegations put forth by the then-sitting president. They say Dominion is cherry-picking these messages. They say it's trying to chill speech so that people don't cover things they don't want to.
So the mainstream media has a good point that Fox is not a news organization like other news organizations. So Fox isn't different from ABC, CNN, NBC in the sense that it has a bias. Yeah, Fox has a bias, but Fox doesn't even try to present the news accurately frequently. So the New York Times, for example, is a left-wing publication, but they don't carry water for the Democrats to the same extent that Fox News consistently carries water for Republicans.
Cover things they don't want it covered, and they say Dominion didn't really suffer the harm it claims and certainly doesn't deserve $1.6 billion it's seeking in the suit.
Very briefly, David, what happens next?
So there's a trial set for April, and generally defamation cases are hard to win. This is an unusually evidence-rich record that Dominion's been presenting in these filings. So as a result, a number of media lawyers I've talked to really do expect a settlement. That's if Dominion is willing to take the money, and if, and this is a real question, they can wrangle some kind of apology out of Fox News, which the network has so far been unwilling to give.
And Tim Pool, he's also just terrible. I mean, you get stupider when you start watching Tim Pool. Right, let's have
Is the fix already in?
It is a damning indictment of Fox News.
The outcome of our presidential election was seized from the hands of voters.
As a network publicly and repeatedly promoted former President Trump's 2020 election fraud claims to millions of their viewers.
Every American should be angry. You should be outraged. You should be worried. You should be concerned at what has happened in the election and the lead up to this election.
Privately, top anchors and executives mocked Trump's lies, calling.
So pundits get a following to the extent that they tell a particular audience what they want to hear. Right? It's not the profundity, the morality, the philosophical consistency, the rhetorical beauty of what they have to say. It is they're servicing a client just like a prostitute.
Them ludicrous, really crazy stuff and totally off the rails. The revelations coming from hundreds of pages of newly released evidence in the legal filing as part of the Dominion voting system's lawsuit against Fox News. In this text exchanged 2 weeks after the election, Tucker Carlson texting other Fox News hosts. Sidney Powell is lying, by the way. I caught her. It's insane. He says about Trump's lawyer, Sidney Powell, and Rudy Giuliani's unfounded claims. Sidney is a complete nut. No one will work with her. Ditto with Rudy, Laura Ingraham wrote back. Tucker responds, it's unbelievably offensive to me. Our viewers are good people, and they believe it. Even as those same hosts went on the air arguing completely otherwise.
All right, these election challenges are still going on, and disturbing irregularities have been found and must be investigated to the fullest.
On election night, the network first to call Arizona for Biden.
The Fox News decision desk is calling Arizona for Joe Biden. That is a big get for the Biden campaign.
As Trump's baseless conspiracy theories started to take hold.
This is a fraud on the American public. So we'll be going to the U.S. Supreme Court.
Carlson wrote his producer warning that Trump could easily destroy us if we play it wrong. The court documents showing a scramble behind the scenes as viewers rebelled against Fox for calling the contest in Biden's favor, and a course correction internally to prioritize profitability over the truth. After Fox News reporter Jackie Henrich fact-checked a Trump tweet about votes being destroyed, Tucker Carlson texting his colleagues, please get her fired. Seriously, what the F? It's measurably hurting the company. The stock price is down. Fox News in a statement argues the court filing contains cherry-picked quotes lacking context, as Fox News hosts continue this week to sow doubt.
Was the 2020 election a miracle? Honestly, we don't know. We don't expect to get an answer to it tonight.
Okay, some good stuff there from CNN. So everyone is better off with accurate criticism. That seems very accurate criticism of Fox coming from, first of all, David Folkenflik, the media reporter at NPR, and then CNN's report on Tucker Carlson and company. Okay, that's going to do it for now. Take care. Bye-bye.